The conference room fell silent as Marcus slid the envelope across the table toward Ethan with a smirk that promised destruction. Inside was a single handwritten dare that would either make him a legend or end his career before lunch. Ask out Victoria Kane, the untouchable VP who'd reduced grown men to stammering children with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. What Ethan didn't know was that this wasn't just office entertainment. It was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to humiliate him, compromise her, and protect secrets worth millions. By the time he understood what he'd walked into, a construction crane would be swaying in a storm, lives would hang in the balance, and the truth would cost more than anyone expected to pay. If you want to see how a simple dare exposed corruption at the highest levels and proved that integrity under pressure is the only currency that matters, stay with me until the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Ethan Hale had learned early in his career that construction sites revealed character faster than any interview ever could. A man might present polished credentials in a boardroom, but put him on scaffolding 40 feet up with weather rolling in and deadlines looming, and you'd see who he really was within an hour. It was a truth that had served Ethan well through 7 years of site consultation, keeping him employed, respected, and carefully distant from the political games that consumed most corporate environments. Which was exactly why he should have recognized the setup the moment Marcus Chen leaned back in his chair that Tuesday morning, wearing the expression of a man who'd just drawn a royal flush. The weekly project meeting had wrapped up 15 minutes earlier than usual, always a bad sign in Ethan's experience. When meetings ended early, it meant either everything was running perfectly, which never happened, or the real business was about to begin off the record. He'd started gathering his notes, already mentally reviewing the site inspection scheduled for Thursday, when Marcus cleared his throat with theatrical precision. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced casualness that preceded terrible ideas, "I believe we have some unfinished business." Ethan glanced up to find 5 pairs of eyes fixed on him with varying degrees of amusement and anticipation. Marcus Chen, senior project coordinator and the closest thing their division had to a social director. David Ross, whose laugh always arrived half a beat too late, like he was waiting for permission. Miguel Santos, quiet and watchful, whom Ethan had always liked despite his association with this group. Jake Morrison, who treated every interaction like a negotiation he was determined to win. And Peter Walsh, newest to the team, still eager enough to laugh at jokes that weren't funny if it meant acceptance. "I'm not sure what you mean," Ethan said carefully, though experience suggested he probably didn't want to know. Marcus produced an envelope from his briefcase with the flourish of a magician revealing his final trick. The paper was expensive, cream-colored, the kind used for formal invitations or termination notices. He placed it on the conference table and slid it across the polished surface with one finger, the gesture somehow making it clear that picking it up would constitute acceptance of terms not yet stated. "We've been discussing your situation," Marcus continued, his smile widening. "Your unmarried situation. Your consistently, reliably, almost admirably unmarried situation." "I wasn't aware my personal life was a project concern," Ethan replied, leaving the envelope untouched. He could feel the setup taking shape around him, each word carefully chosen to box him into a corner that would seem like his own choice. "It's not a concern," Jake interjected, leaning forward with the intensity he usually reserved for budget negotiations. "It's an opportunity. See, we've noticed that you've been with the company almost 8 years, and in that time you've never once attended a company social event with a date. Never joined us for happy hour when we're talking about our weekend plans, never even mentioned anyone you're seeing." "I prefer to keep my professional and personal lives separate," Ethan said, which was true as far as it went. The complete truth was more complicated. He'd watched too many careers implode because someone couldn't resist mixing work with romance, had seen relationships that started in corporate environments curdle into harassment complaints and hostile work environments. The mathematics were simple. The temporary pleasure of workplace dating rarely outweighed the permanent complications it created. "Exactly," Marcus said triumphantly, as if Ethan had just made his point for him. "You're disciplined, professional. You maintain boundaries that most men can't manage, which is precisely why you're the perfect candidate for our little experiment." Ethan's instincts, honed through years of identifying structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures, began sending urgent warnings. What experiment? Marcus tapped the envelope. Inside this, you'll find a simple challenge, a dare, if you want to use playground terminology. Complete it successfully, and you'll have our respect, our admiration, and bragging rights that'll last until retirement. Decline it, and well, he shrugged eloquently, we'll understand that perhaps your legendary professionalism is actually just fear dressed up in business casual. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Accept, and he'd be committed to whatever ridiculous task they'd devised, probably designed to embarrass him in front of colleagues or clients. Decline, and he'd spend the next however many years fielding subtle implications about his courage, his manhood, his worthiness to run with this particular pack. It was a lose-lose proposition wrapped in masculine posturing, and Ethan's first instinct was to stand up, wish them well, and return to actual work. But something in Marcus's expression stopped him. There was anticipation there, certainly, but also something sharper, something that looked less like fraternity hazing and more like a chess player watching an opponent reach for the piece that would guarantee checkmate. Marcus wanted him to walk away, was counting on it even, which meant whatever was in that envelope, Marcus believed it would achieve something whether Ethan accepted or declined. The dare itself was secondary to the mere fact of having offered it. Ethan picked up the envelope. "There we go," David said, his laugh arriving right on cue. "I told you he'd go for it." The paper inside was thick, expensive, like the envelope. Someone had taken time with this, which suggested premeditation rather than spontaneous mischief. The handwriting was Marcus's. Ethan recognized it from 100 project documents, but the phrasing had been workshopped, refined, each word chosen for maximum impact. The dare. Ask Victoria Kane to dinner, not as a professional courtesy, not as a networking opportunity, a real date. Romantic intent clearly stated. Before Friday at 5 p.m. Ethan read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood. Then he looked up at 5 faces arranged in expressions ranging from eager anticipation to barely suppressed glee, and understood that he'd misunderstood nothing. They were serious. They were actually serious. "Victoria Kane," he said slowly, testing the words to make sure they meant what he thought they meant. "Our Victoria Kane, the Vice President of Strategic Development, your direct supervisor, Marcus, the woman who restructured 3 departments last quarter and whose approval rating among executives is somewhere between mythical and terrifying." "The very same," Marcus confirmed cheerfully. "We figured if you're going to break your streak of professional detachment, might as well aim high, right?" "This is insane." Ethan placed the paper back on the table like it might be contagious. "This is beyond insane. This is career suicide wrapped in sexual harassment litigation." "Only if you're clumsy about it," Jake said. "Which is part of the test, really. Can the great Ethan Hale, master of professional boundaries, navigate a simple social interaction without hiding behind corporate protocol? There's nothing simple about what you're suggesting." Ethan stood, gathering his materials with deliberate calm despite the anger building in his chest. "Victoria Kane is not a punchline for your entertainment. She's a senior executive who's earned her position through competence and intelligence, and she deserves basic respect, which apparently is too much to expect from— $7,500, Marcus interrupted. Ethan stopped. "What?" $7,500. "That's what's riding on this dare. Each of us put in $1,500. Marcus gestured around the table. "Winner takes all, depending on how far you get. Just asking her out, you get nothing. We split the pot for having the entertainment value. She says yes, you get $3,000. She says yes and you actually go, you get it all. You're betting on this." Ethan heard his voice go flat, the tone he used when inspecting work so substandard that anger would be wasted. "You've created a gambling pool around me, asking out a senior executive. Think of it as incentivized risk-taking," Jake offered. "Corporate culture building. Think of it as me reporting this to HR the moment I leave this room." "With what evidence?" Marcus spread his hands innocently. "A piece of paper with handwriting that could be anyone's? A conversation between colleagues about hypothetical social interactions? Good luck proving intent." He leaned back, perfectly relaxed. "Besides, Ethan, we both know you won't report it, because that would mean explaining why you're so threatened by a simple dare, why the idea of having an honest conversation with an attractive, accomplished woman makes you panic." There it was, the real hook, carefully baited. refuse, and carry the implication of cowardice. Report it, and face the same accusation wrapped in bureaucratic process that would ultimately go nowhere while poisoning his professional relationships. Accept, and become complicit in reducing a respected executive to a bet, a game piece, entertainment for men who should know better. Ethan looked at each of them in turn, reading futures in their expressions. Marcus, confident in his manipulation, certain he'd created a scenario where every outcome served his purposes. Jake, already counting his share of the winnings, unconcerned with anything beyond the transaction. David, uncomfortable now that the plan was in motion but too invested to back out. Peter, newest and therefore most desperate to belong, watching Ethan with something that might have been hope that someone would stand up and say this was wrong. And Miguel, meeting his gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. "I need to think about it," Ethan heard himself say, and hated the words even as they left his mouth. "You've got until Friday," Marcus reminded him. 5 p.m. Though honestly, the longer you wait, the more pathetic it looks. Nothing says confidence like needing a week to work up courage for a simple dinner invitation. Ethan left the conference room with their laughter following him into the hallway, feeling like he'd just failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. His office was 3 doors down, a modest space with a window that overlooked the construction yard where current projects took shape in steel and concrete. He closed the door, sat at his desk, and stared at the city skyline without seeing it. The intelligent move was obvious: decline the dare, document the conversation as best he could, and maintain his professional distance from the whole mess. Let them have their laugh, collect their money however they decided to split it, and move on. In 6 months, it would be forgotten. In a year, half of them would probably be working somewhere else anyway, the way corporate positions churned through ambitious men who mistook aggression for leadership. But something about Marcus's expression kept replaying in his mind. That certainty. That satisfaction. Like a man watching pieces fall exactly where he'd predicted, regardless of which choice his opponent made. What was Marcus actually trying to accomplish? Ethan pulled out his laptop and opened the company directory, navigating to Victoria Kane's profile with the clinical detachment of someone researching a project specification rather than a person. The photograph showed a woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back severely, expression neutral, eyes that suggested she was already evaluating whoever was looking at her photo and finding them moderately disappointing. Her credentials were impressive: MBA from Stanford, 10 years at a Fortune 500 company before joining their firm 18 months ago, responsible for overseeing $70 million in active development projects. But it was her reputation that made Marcus's dare so ridiculous. Victoria Kane didn't do office politics, didn't attend happy hours unless they were explicitly professional development, didn't engage in the subtle social hierarchies that govern most corporate environments. She evaluated work, approved or rejected proposals based on merit, and maintained boundaries so clear they might as well have been constructed from the same steel and concrete she oversaw. 3 men had been terminated in her first 6 months for various attempts to leverage charm, flattery, or intimidation into professional advantage. Not for harassment, Victoria was too smart to let situations deteriorate that far, but for performance failures that somehow became visible only after they'd mistaken her professionalism for an invitation to something more casual. The message had been received. Victoria Kane was untouchable not because she was cold, but because she was absolutely uninterested in any interaction that didn't serve clear professional purposes, which made the dare either stupidly optimistic or deliberately designed to fail. And if it was designed to fail, what did Marcus gain from Ethan's public rejection? His desk phone rang, the internal line indicating someone calling from within the building. Ethan considered letting it go to voicemail, then recognized the extension, Victoria Kane's office. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Ethan Hale. "Mr. Hale, this is Jennifer, Ms. Kane's assistant. She'd like to see you in her office at your earliest convenience." Ethan glanced at his watch, 10:47 a.m. The meeting had ended barely 20 minutes ago. Did she indicate what this was regarding? "The Riverside project. She has some questions about your last inspection report." "I can be there in 10 minutes. "Perfect. I'll let her know." The line disconnected, leaving Ethan staring at his phone and wondering if the universe had a sense of humor or just terrible timing. The Riverside project was one of his current assignments, a mixed-use development that had been plagued with complications since breaking ground 4 months ago. His last report had flagged some concerning shortcuts in the foundation work, recommendations that would add 3 weeks to the schedule and $200,000 to the budget, recommendations that someone higher up the chain would need to approve or reject. Someone like Victoria Kane. Ethan gathered the relevant files, checked that his tie was straight more out of habit than vanity, and tried not to think about the envelope still sitting on the conference room table. This was professional. This was work. Whatever Marcus and his gambling pool thought they were accomplishing, it had nothing to do with an actual consultation about an actual project that affected actual safety and compliance standards. Victoria's office was on the 12th floor, corner position with windows offering views of both the city and the construction yards that represented their current portfolio. Ethan had been there twice before, both times for project reviews that had felt more like doctoral defenses than status updates. Victoria didn't waste time on small talk or social lubrication. She asked precise questions, expected precise answers, and moved forward the moment she had the information she needed. Jennifer, her assistant, was on the phone when Ethan arrived, but gestured him toward the closed door with a smile that suggested he should knock rather than wait. He did, 2 sharp raps that he hoped conveyed professional confidence rather than the uncertainty currently churning in his gut. "Come in." Victoria Kane's voice carried the same quality as her photograph, neutral, evaluative, giving nothing away. Ethan opened the door and found her standing by the window, holding what he recognized as his Riverside report, sticky notes marking at least a dozen pages. "Mr. Hale, thank you for coming up." She gestured to one of the chairs facing her desk. "I've been reviewing your assessment of the Riverside Foundation work, and I need clarification on several points before I present this to the executive committee." Ethan sat, pulling out his tablet where he'd stored photographs and measurements from the inspection. "Of course. What specific concerns?" "All of them," Victoria interrupted, moving to her desk with the economical grace of someone who'd learned not to waste motion any more than words. "You've recommended a complete halt to pouring until we can verify the rebar placement meets code specifications. You've suggested that approximately 40% of the work completed to date may need to be redone, and you've estimated costs that will effectively eliminate any profit margin on this phase of the project." She said it without inflection, without accusation, simply stating facts as she understood them. But Ethan heard the question underneath. "Are you absolutely certain? Because if you're wrong, this will cost us significantly more than money." "I am certain," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "The rebar spacing in grid sections D through F is inconsistent with both the approved plans and basic load-bearing requirements for a structure of this type. The concrete quality tests from last week's pour show aggregate separation that suggests improper mixing ratios or contaminated water supply. And the installation timeline for the work supposedly completed doesn't align with the crew logs I reviewed. Meaning someone claimed work was done that either wasn't done at all or was done so quickly that quality control became impossible." Victoria set the report down, her expression unchanged but something sharpening in her eyes. "You're suggesting fraud." "I'm suggesting that what's been built doesn't match what's been documented, and the discrepancy is large enough that it can't be accidental." Ethan pulled up photographs on his tablet, turned it so she could see. "This is grid section E, which according to the daily logs was completed over 3 days with a full crew. But the concrete pour marks show it was done in a single day, probably with half the usual crew, which would explain why the finishing work is substandard." Victoria studied the images with the focus of someone reading a complex contract, seeing implications that went beyond the immediate content. "Who's the site supervisor for Riverside?" "Gary Mitchell. He's been with the company 6 years, clean record, no previous issues that I'm aware of." "And he signed off on all this work?" "His signature is on every daily log, yes. But you don't think he was actually present for the inspections?" It wasn't a question, and Ethan appreciated that she'd drawn the conclusion herself, rather than making him spell out an accusation against a colleague. "I think the timeline and the quality of work suggests that whoever was doing the actual inspection was either incompetent or deliberately overlooking problems." Victoria nodded slowly, turning back to the window. For a long moment she said nothing, and Ethan waited. understanding that she was working through implications that extended beyond this one project. If the Riverside work was compromised, how many other projects might have similar issues? If Gary Mitchell was signing off on work he hadn't properly inspected, was it isolated incompetence or part of a larger pattern? And most importantly, who else knew about this before Ethan's report made it impossible to ignore? "I need you to do something for me," Victoria said finally, still facing the window. "And I need you to understand that I'm asking as someone who values accuracy over convenience. All right? I need you to go back to the Riverside site, not for another official inspection. That would tip off anyone paying attention that we're looking closely. I need you to do what you do best, which is observe without being obvious about it. Watch how the crew operates. See who's actually supervising. Note any discrepancies between what's being built and what's being documented." She turned to face him, and Ethan saw something in her expression that he'd never noticed before. Not coldness, but the careful control of someone who'd learned not to show vulnerability in environments designed to exploit it. "This company has a reputation," Victoria continued. "We build structures that last, that meet or exceed every safety standard, that don't collapse or crack or fail because someone wanted to save 3 days and $20,000. If that reputation is being compromised by fraud or incompetence, I need to know. And I need proof that will stand up not just to our executive committee, but to regulatory review if it comes to that." "You think it will?" "I think that if you're right about the scope of the problem, we're looking at potential criminal charges, massive financial liability, and the end of several careers, which means people will fight to contain it, to minimize it, to make it someone else's problem." She met his eyes steadily. "Can I trust you to get me accurate information regardless of who it implicates?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications that went beyond this single conversation. Ethan thought about Marcus's dare, about the envelope on the conference room table, about the gambling pool that treated human interactions like sports betting. He thought about the careful manipulation that had brought him here, wondering if any of it was coincidence or if Marcus had somehow known that Victoria would call him up here today, would ask him to investigate something that might end up destroying careers. And he thought about integrity under pressure, about the difference between professional boundaries designed to protect everyone and barriers built from fear of authentic connection. "Yes," he said, "you can trust me." Victoria nodded once, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and warning. "Good. I'll arrange for you to have unrestricted site access starting tomorrow. As far as anyone asks, you're conducting follow-up measurements for the amended compliance report, which is technically true. I do need you to provide detailed documentation of every discrepancy you find." "Understood. One more thing, Mr. Hale." She picked up his report, adding it to a stack of folders that suggested this was far from her only crisis today. "The kind of fraud we're potentially looking at doesn't happen in isolation. Someone benefits from the shortcuts, from the falsified logs, from work that looks complete on paper but isn't up to standard in reality. When you're at the site, pay attention not just to what's wrong, but to who might have reasons to keep it hidden." Ethan stood, recognizing a dismissal when he heard one. "I will." He was almost to the door when Victoria spoke again, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been dry humor. "And Mr. Hale, whatever else happens with the Riverside investigation, I appreciate that you reported what you found rather than looking the other way. It would have been easier to sign off on work that wasn't your responsibility and let someone else discover the problems later." "Easier," Ethan agreed, "but not right." "No," Victoria said, "not right." He left her office with more questions than he'd arrived with, wondering why Marcus had really created that dare, what the Riverside project had to do with it, and whether he'd just been handed an assignment that was professional due diligence or a test of loyalties that went deeper than construction specifications. His phone buzzed with a text message as he waited for the elevator. Marcus, naturally, because the universe apparently wasn't done with him yet. "So? Did you ask her? Don't leave us in suspense." Ethan stared at the message, then at the elevator doors, then back at his phone. He could respond with exactly what had happened. A professional consultation about a troubled project. He could ignore it entirely. Or he could do something that would either prove he was braver than Marcus expected or stupider than he'd ever given himself credit for. He typed, "Not yet, but I'm working on it." The elevator arrived and Ethan stepped inside. committed now to a course of action he didn't fully understand, but sensed was inevitable from the moment Marcus had slid that envelope across the table. Whatever trap was being set, whatever game was being played, he was going to see it through to the end, but on his terms, with his standards, and with enough respect for Victoria Kane to make sure that whatever happened, she was treated as a person making choices rather than a prize to be won or a challenge to be overcome. The real dare, Ethan was beginning to understand, wasn't asking Victoria out. It was navigating the minefield of corporate politics, masculine posturing, potential fraud, and his own carefully maintained boundaries without losing himself in the process. He had until Friday at 5 p.m. to figure out how. The Riverside construction site looked different when you were searching for evidence of fraud rather than conducting routine inspections. Ethan arrived Wednesday morning before the regular crew, parking his truck in the visitor section and walking the perimeter with coffee in hand, playing the role of a consultant doing preliminary measurements before the day's chaos began. The site sprawled across 4 acres of what had been a textile factory 40 years ago, now transformed into the skeleton of a mixed-use development that promised luxury apartments, retail space, and a public park. The foundation work dominated the central area, massive concrete sections already poured and curing, rebar grids rising from the ground like industrial sculpture waiting for their next layer. It should have been a testament to precision engineering and careful planning. Instead, it looked like a crime scene waiting to be discovered. Ethan spent the first hour simply watching. The crew arrived in clusters. The concrete workers in one group, the rebar specialists in another, the general laborers who'd do whatever was needed wherever chaos demanded. Gary Mitchell pulled up 15 minutes late, which might mean nothing or might mean everything, depending on what Ethan found in the next few days. The site supervisor climbed out of his truck with the weathered confidence of a man who'd spent decades in construction, greeting workers by name, reviewing the day's schedule with his foreman, everything appearing entirely normal. Which was the problem with fraud. It always appeared normal until someone looked close enough to see the cracks. By 10 a.m., Ethan had positioned himself near grid section F, measuring equipment setup, making a show of checking dimensions while actually studying the crew's rhythm. The pour scheduled for today would cover roughly 2,000 square feet, work that should take a full day with the crew they had on site. But according to the logs Victoria had shown him, similar pours had been completed in half the time, which suggested either this crew was unusually slow or the previous logs were unusually creative. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," a voice said behind him. Ethan turned to find Gary Mitchell approaching, carrying the casual authority of a man comfortable in his domain. Ms. Kane wanted additional measurements for the compliance amendment. Figured I'd knock it out while the crew's working so I can see the process in real time. Makes sense. Gary surveyed the section Ethan was measuring, his expression neutral. Though I thought your report already covered the foundation work pretty thoroughly. Seemed like you found every crack and inconsistency from here to the property line. There was no hostility in the words, just statement of fact. But Ethan heard the question underneath. Why are you really here? And what are you looking for that you didn't find the first time? The report raised questions, Ethan said carefully. This is about getting answers that'll satisfy the executive review. You know how it is. One person says the work's substandard. Everyone wants documentation that could survive a lawsuit. Gary nodded slowly, understanding the politics, even if he didn't like them. Well, you won't find anything wrong with today's pour. We're following the specs exactly, and I'll be here the whole time making sure every yard of concrete goes exactly where it's supposed to. I'm sure it will, Ethan agreed, which was probably true. The problem wasn't what was happening now, under scrutiny and observation. The problem was what had happened before anyone was paying attention. Gary moved on to confer with his foreman, leaving Ethan to his measurements and his thoughts. The morning stretched into afternoon, concrete trucks arriving in sequence, crews working with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this thousands of times. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Perfect, even. Which made Ethan wonder if Gary had suspected this inspection was coming, had warned the crew to be especially careful today, had ensured that whatever shortcuts had been taken previously wouldn't be visible in the current work. His phone buzzed at 2:15. Victoria Kane, calling rather than texting, which suggested privacy mattered. Hale. Mr. Hale, I need you back at the office. Something's come up with the Riverside project that requires immediate attention. I'm at the site now. I know where you are. I need you here within the hour. We'll discuss what you've observed when you arrive. The line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at his phone and wondering what could have happened in the 6 hours since he'd left Victoria's office that required pulling him off site. He packed his equipment, made his excuses to Gary about needing to review something at the office, and drove back through midday traffic with the uncomfortable sensation that whatever game was being played had just changed rules he didn't understand. Victoria's assistant waved him directly through when he arrived, which meant the situation was urgent enough to bypass normal protocols. He knocked once and entered to find Victoria standing by her desk with another man Ethan didn't recognize. Late 40s, expensive suit, the kind of corporate polish that suggested either high-level management or legal representation. "Mr. Hale, this is Robert Caldwell, our Senior Vice President of Operations," Victoria said. "Robert, this is Ethan Hale, the site consultant whose report initiated our review of the Riverside project." Robert extended his hand with the firm grip of a man who'd built a career on projecting confidence regardless of circumstances. "I've read your report, Mr. Hale. Very thorough, very concerning, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly before we take this matter any further." Ethan shook his hand, already sensing trouble in the careful phrasing. "I'm happy to answer any questions about my findings. Actually, I have some findings of my own I'd like to share." Robert moved to Victoria's desk, spreading out what appeared to be financial documents and construction logs. "I've spent the last several hours reviewing the Riverside project timeline, and I've discovered some interesting discrepancies that I think shed new light on your concerns." He pointed to a series of entries in the crew logs, dates highlighted in yellow. "These are the pores you identified as potentially problematic, work that appeared to be completed too quickly to maintain quality standards. But when I cross-referenced them with our payment records, I found that we actually had additional subcontractors on site during those periods. Crews that weren't reflected in the daily logs because they were hired through a different billing system." Ethan studied the documents, looking for the trap he knew had to be there. "Additional crews would explain the timeline, but they don't explain the quality issues I documented. The concrete separation, the rebar spacing inconsistencies, which brings me to my second point." Robert produced a folder containing what looked like laboratory reports. "I had samples from those same pores retested by an independent facility. Their findings indicate that the concrete meets all specification requirements. The aggregate separation you noted appears to have been localized to the test samples, not representative of the overall pore quality." Victoria's expression remained neutral, but Ethan noticed her hands had stilled on the desk, the way someone's would when they were carefully controlling their reaction. She'd called him back here for this, which meant either she wanted him to hear Robert's explanation directly, or she wanted him to see something in it that she couldn't point to explicitly. "And the rebar spacing?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "I have photographs documenting inconsistencies across multiple grid sections." "Photographs can be misleading," Robert said smoothly. "Angles, lighting, perspective, all of these can make properly spaced rebar appear uneven. I had our structural engineer review your images, and his assessment is that what you interpreted as code violations are actually within acceptable tolerance ranges." It was a masterful rebuttal, professional and thorough, completely reasonable if you didn't know it was built on foundations as unstable as the concrete Ethan had flagged. Additional crews that conveniently weren't documented where anyone could verify them. Retests conducted by facilities that could be pressured or paid to deliver desired results. Expert assessments from engineers whose careers depended on maintaining good relationships with senior management. Ethan looked at Victoria, trying to read what she wanted from him. Capitulation? Defense of his findings? A fight that would cost him credibility and accomplish nothing? Her expression gave him nothing except the smallest tilt of her head, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or warning or simply observation. "I stand by my report," Ethan said finally. "If additional crews were present, they should have been documented in the daily logs regardless of billing systems. If the retests show different results than the original samples, that suggests either contamination in the sampling process or inconsistency in the concrete supply. And no photograph tricks or tolerance ranges explain why work that should take days was completed in hours." Robert's smile never wavered. "I appreciate your conviction, Mr. Hale. I really do. It's exactly the kind of diligence we want in our consultants. But conviction without flexibility can become obstruction, especially when new evidence emerges that contradicts initial assessments. He began gathering his documents. I'm recommending to the executive committee that we continue with the Riverside project as currently planned, with enhanced oversight going forward to ensure quality standards are maintained. Your concerns will be noted in the record, but I don't believe they warrant the complete work stoppage you suggested. That's a mistake, Ethan said. Perhaps. Robert tucked the folders under his arm. But it's a mistake I'm willing to take responsibility for, which is more than most people can say. He turned to Victoria. I'll have my formal recommendation on your desk by end of day. I trust you'll support it when we present to the committee tomorrow. It wasn't a question, and the threat underneath was clear enough. Support the decision or find yourself on the wrong side of the senior vice president of operations, which was a good way to discover that your career advancement had suddenly stalled indefinitely. Victoria nodded once. I'll review your recommendation and respond accordingly. Robert left, taking his manufactured evidence and polished lies with him, leaving Ethan and Victoria in a silence that felt like the moment after a bomb detonates but before the debris starts falling. That was a setup, Ethan said. Yes. He had all those documents ready. The retests, the billing records, the structural engineer's assessment. He knew I'd be called back here today to hear his rebuttal. Yes. Which means someone told him I was conducting follow-up inspection. Someone who knew you'd sent me to the site and wanted to undermine my findings before I could develop them further. Victoria moved to the window, her back to him, and Ethan recognized the posture from their first meeting. Someone working through implications that extended beyond the immediate conversation. Mr. Caldwell has been with this company 15 years. He's well-connected, well-liked, and very effective at managing situations that might otherwise become complicated. If there are problems with the Riverside project, problems that could expose the company to liability or regulatory scrutiny, Robert is exactly the person who would be tasked with containing them. By discrediting my report. By providing alternative explanations that are plausible enough to give the executive committee cover for making the decision they want to make anyway. She turned to face him. Building projects generate profit. Stopping building projects generates questions, delays, and expenses. Given a choice between trusting a consultant who's been here 7 years or a senior vice president who's been here 15, which do you think they'll choose? The answer was obvious, and Ethan felt something shifting in his understanding of what he'd walked into. This wasn't about a dare or a gambling pool or Marcus's manipulation. This was about money and power and the systems that protected both regardless of truth. What do you want me to do? He asked. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the sense of being evaluated according to criteria he couldn't see but that would determine everything about what happened next. I want you to understand something, she said finally. I called you back here today, not because I doubted your findings, but because I needed you to see how this works. Robert's performance wasn't for my benefit. He knows I'm not going to be swayed by creative accounting and convenient retests. It was for yours. He wanted you to understand that challenging his narrative comes with costs, professional costs, career costs, the kind of costs that most people decide aren't worth paying. Are you telling me to back down? I'm telling you that if you continue pursuing this, you need to be absolutely certain it's for the right reasons. Not because of ego or stubbornness or some misguided sense of martyrdom, but because you genuinely believe that buildings constructed on fraudulent foundations put lives at risk. Ethan thought about the concrete he'd inspected, the rebar grids that didn't match specifications, the timeline that made no sense unless someone was cutting corners in ways that compromised structural integrity. He thought about the people who would eventually live in those apartments, work in that retail space, walk through that public park, all of them trusting that the building around them had been constructed properly. I'm certain, he said. Good. Victoria returned to her desk, pulling out a folder from a locked drawer. Then I need you to do something that goes beyond your official duties. I need you to help me build a case that Robert can't explain away with creative documentation and expert opinions. She opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be financial records, emails, and construction timelines spanning multiple projects, not just Riverside. For the past 3 months, I've been tracking discrepancies across our entire portfolio. Projects that come in under budget and ahead of schedule, which sounds positive until you realize it's mathematically improbable given the scope and complexity of the work. Crew logs that show consistent patterns of work being completed faster than industry standards would suggest. And subcontractor payments that don't quite align with the documented work. Ethan leaned forward, scanning the documents. You think it's systematic? I think Robert Caldwell has been running a scheme where he hires subcontractors at legitimate rates, uses them for half the documented time, pockets the difference, and covers the timeline discrepancies by having crews cut corners on quality. The additional subcontractors he mentioned today, they probably don't exist. The retest showing acceptable concrete, probably conducted on samples from a different batch or a different project entirely. The structural engineer who says my photos are misleading, probably on Robert's payroll in ways that don't show up in official records. That's fraud on a massive scale. That's fraud that's made Robert very wealthy and the company very profitable, which means proving it will require evidence so overwhelming that the executive committee can't ignore it. Victoria met his eyes. I can track the financial discrepancies, but I need someone who understands the technical side. Someone who can document exactly how the work being done doesn't match the work being claimed. Someone who has enough integrity to see this through even when it gets ugly. Ethan understood what she was offering and what it would cost. This wasn't a simple assignment with a clear endpoint. This was an investigation that could take weeks or months, that would put him in direct opposition to a senior vice president, that would make him a target for exactly the kind of professional destruction Marcus had been trying to orchestrate with that stupid dare. And somewhere in his mind, Marcus's voice echoed, can the great Ethan Hale navigate a simple social interaction without hiding behind corporate protocol? Maybe this was the real test. Not asking Victoria to dinner, but choosing to stand beside her when doing so meant risking everything. I'll help you, Ethan said, but I need you to understand something too. If we do this, if we go after Robert Caldwell with accusations of fraud, we can't afford to be wrong. We need evidence that would stand up in court, not just internal review. And we need to be prepared for him to fight back with everything he has. I know. Which means we need to be smart about how we gather information. No more official inspections that tip him off. No more reports that give him time to manufacture explanations. We need to document everything in ways he doesn't see coming until it's too late to spin. Victoria nodded slowly, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but acknowledgement of a partnership forming on terms neither had expected. Then we should probably discuss strategy somewhere other than my office, where every conversation is potentially monitored and every document is potentially accessible to people we don't trust. Are you suggesting we meet outside of work? I'm suggesting that if we're going to build a case against a senior vice president who's been stealing from this company for months or years, we should do it somewhere he can't easily observe or interrupt. She glanced at her watch. There's a coffee shop 3 blocks from here. Neutral territory, public enough to avoid questions about impropriety, quiet enough for sensitive conversation. Ethan felt the irony of the situation settling over him like weight. Here he was, being asked by Victoria Kane to meet her outside the office, to spend time together away from professional context, to develop a relationship built on trust and shared purpose. Everything Marcus's dare had demanded, but for completely different reasons, and in ways that made the original challenge seem absurd and insulting. When? He asked. Tonight, 7 o'clock. And Mr. Hale? Victoria's expression grew serious. When we meet, we're not colleagues following corporate hierarchy. We're 2 people trying to do the right thing in a situation designed to punish exactly that choice. Which means I need you to be honest with me, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Can you do that? The question hung between them, weighted with implications that extended beyond fraud investigations and corporate politics. Ethan thought about boundaries and professionalism, about the difference between protecting yourself and isolating yourself, about what it meant to trust someone enough to be vulnerable in their presence. Yes, he said, I can do that. He left Victoria's office with the uncomfortable awareness that he'd just committed to something far more complicated than proving construction fraud. He'd committed to treating Victoria Kane as a human being rather than an untouchable executive, to seeing her as a partner rather than a superior, to building the kind of trust that couldn't survive behind professional masks and corporate formality. His phone buzzed the moment he reached the elevator. Marcus again. Because apparently the universe had perfect timing for maximum irony. Clock's ticking, Hale. Friday deadline stands. Don't chicken out now. Ethan stared at the message, then typed a response he knew would either satisfy Marcus's expectations or accelerate whatever trap was being set. Meeting her tonight. Wish me luck. The reply came within seconds. Holy shit, he's actually doing it. Drinks are on you when this blows up. Ethan pocketed his phone, wondering if Marcus had any idea how right he was about things blowing up, just not in the way he expected. This wasn't about a dare anymore. This was about choosing between the safe path of professional distance and the dangerous path of authentic connection in an environment designed to punish both. The coffee shop Victoria had suggested was called The Grind, which Ethan appreciated for its lack of pretension. No artisanal, single-origin descriptions. No Instagram-worthy latte art. Just good coffee served in actual mugs by people who understood that sometimes you needed caffeine more than atmosphere. He arrived 10 minutes early, claimed a corner table that offered privacy without looking like they were hiding, and tried not to overthink what was about to happen. Victoria arrived exactly at 7, wearing jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her look more intimidating than the business suits she wore at the office. She'd pulled her hair back in a casual ponytail, and Ethan realized he'd never seen her looking quite this unguarded, this human, this real. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Thank you for trusting me." Victoria signaled the waitress, ordered black coffee without consulting the menu, and then turned her full attention to Ethan in a way that made him understand why people found her intimidating. It wasn't coldness. It was the absolute focus of someone who didn't waste time on social performance when authenticity was available. "I need to tell you something before we discuss the fraud investigation," she said, "and I need you to hear it as information that affects our working relationship, not as a personal confession seeking sympathy." Ethan nodded, uncertain where this was going, but recognizing the weight of whatever she was about to share. "I've been in this industry 20 years, Victoria continued. "I've worked my way up from project coordinator to vice president, and I've done it by being better, smarter, and more thorough than every man who assumed I was there for decoration or diversity metrics. I've maintained boundaries that most people consider excessive because those boundaries are the only thing standing between professional respect and being reduced to someone's fantasy or target." She paused as the waitress delivered their coffee, then continued without acknowledging the interruption. 3 weeks ago, I received information suggesting that Robert Caldwell had been manipulating construction projects for personal profit. The source was anonymous, credible, and detailed enough that I couldn't ignore it. When I brought it to the CEO's attention, I was told to gather more evidence before making accusations that could damage Robert's reputation. "Let me guess," Ethan said. "You were also told to be careful about seeming vindictive or ambitious." The exact phrase was emotionally motivated, which is corporate code for hysterical woman on a witch hunt. Victoria's expression didn't change, but Ethan heard the anger underneath. "So I started documenting everything I could find, building a case that would be so overwhelming that questions about my motivations would become irrelevant, and then your Riverside report landed on my desk, providing independent confirmation that something was seriously wrong. That's why you asked me to do additional investigation. That's why I asked you to help me build something Robert can't discredit by attacking my credibility or suggesting I have personal agenda against him." She met Ethan's eyes steadily. "I'm trusting you with this because I believe you care more about doing the right thing than protecting your career. But I need you to understand what you're agreeing to. Robert has allies throughout this company, people who benefit from his schemes or who simply owe him favors. If we go after him, they'll come after us." "I understand." "Do you?" Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Because I've seen what happens when people challenge men like Robert Caldwell. They get reassigned to projects no one wants. They discover that their work is suddenly never quite good enough, that promotions they were promised mysteriously evaporate, that their professional reputations get quietly destroyed through whisper campaigns and strategic undermining. I can protect myself to some degree because I have position and documentation, but you're more vulnerable, and I won't lie to you about that risk." Ethan thought about Marcus's dare, about the gambling pool, about the casual cruelty of men who treated other people like game pieces. He thought about Gary Mitchell signing off on fraudulent work logs, about Robert Caldwell, manufacturing evidence, about all the small corruptions that added up to buildings constructed on lies. "I'm still in," he said, "but I have a condition." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "We don't just build a case against Robert. We build it properly, with full documentation, following every legal and ethical standard. Because if we cut corners to expose his corner cutting, we become exactly what we're fighting against." For the first time since entering the coffee shop, Victoria smiled, a real smile, small and genuine. "That's exactly what I needed to hear, because I can work with cautious and ethical. I can't work with reckless and compromised." They spent the next 2 hours reviewing Victoria's documentation, cross-referencing financial records with project timelines, identifying patterns that revealed the scope of Robert's scheme. The evidence was compelling, but incomplete, requiring technical documentation that only someone with Ethan's expertise could provide. They developed a strategy. Ethan would conduct quiet inspections of other projects Robert had overseen, documenting quality issues that matched the Riverside pattern. Victoria would continue tracking financial discrepancies and building the timeline of fraudulent activity. "We'll need to be careful about communication," Victoria said as they prepared to leave. "No emails discussing the investigation, no phone calls that could be recorded, no paper trails that Robert could discover and use against us. How do we coordinate?" "We meet here or somewhere similar. Regular updates, face-to-face. Somewhere we can talk freely." She pulled out her phone, typing something quickly. "I'm sending you my personal number. Not the office line, not the email. My actual cell phone that isn't monitored by corporate IT. Use it only when necessary, and assume anything you say in text could eventually be screenshot and used against you." Ethan's phone buzzed with the incoming number, and he saved it with a simple label, VK. They walked out together into the cool evening, and Ethan was struck by how different this felt from the corporate interactions he'd spent 7 years carefully maintaining. This wasn't networking or alliance building or strategic relationship management. This was two people choosing to trust each other despite every systemic incentive to do otherwise. "Mr. Hale," Victoria said as they reached the sidewalk where their paths would diverge, "I appreciate you taking this risk, more than I can properly express." "Ethan," he said, "if we're going to be meeting in coffee shops and sharing personal phone numbers, you should probably call me Ethan." "Then you should call me Victoria." She extended her hand, and when Ethan shook it, the gesture felt less like professional courtesy and more like sealing a pact. "I'll contact you in a few days with the next projects to review. In the meantime, be careful around Robert and anyone close to him. They're watching now, even if they don't know exactly what for." Ethan drove home through city streets that looked subtly different, as if the conversation had shifted his perception of everything around him. He'd spent 7 years maintaining boundaries designed to keep him safe, professional, separate from the complications that destroyed careers. And in the course of one day, he'd demolished most of those boundaries by choosing to stand beside someone who needed an ally more than she needed another subordinate following corporate hierarchy. His apartment felt too quiet when he arrived, too empty, too much like the isolation he'd convinced himself was strength. He poured a drink he didn't really want and stood by the window looking out at the city, thinking about structural integrity and the ways buildings failed when their foundations were compromised. His phone buzzed. Marcus, naturally, because some patterns were too reliable to break. "Well, how'd it go? Did the Ice Queen say yes, or did she eat you alive?" Ethan stared at the message, wondering how to respond to a question that missed the point so completely it might as well have been asked in a different language. Marcus thought this was about romance, about conquest, about proving something to men whose respect wasn't worth having. He had no idea it was about choosing integrity over safety, about building trust in environments designed to prevent it, about two people deciding that some things mattered more than careers. "We talked," Ethan typed finally. "It went well. I'll update you Friday." The response was immediate. "That's it? You had coffee with Victoria Kane and all you've got is, 'It went well'? You're killing me here, Hale." Ethan set his phone down without responding, unwilling to reduce what had happened to entertainment for Marcus's gambling pool. Whatever game they thought they were playing, whatever trap they thought they'd set, it had become irrelevant the moment Victoria had trusted him with the truth about Robert Caldwell's fraud. The dare wasn't about asking someone to dinner anymore. It was about whether he had enough courage to see this through when everything started falling apart, which Victoria had made clear was inevitable once they moved against Robert. His phone buzzed one more time, but this time it wasn't Marcus. The message came from the number he'd saved as VK, simple and direct. "Thank you for tonight. It's been a long time since I've met someone willing to take risks for the right reasons." "Sleep well." Ethan read the message twice, hearing the subtext underneath the words. Victoria Kane didn't waste time on empty courtesy or meaningless pleasantries. If she was thanking him, it meant the evening had mattered in ways that extended beyond strategy and documentation. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another, and finally settled on something that felt honest without being presumptuous. "Thank you for trusting me. I won't let you down." The city lights blurred together as Ethan stood at his window, committed now to a path that would either expose massive corporate fraud or destroy his career trying. And somewhere in the calculations and risks and uncertain outcomes, he realized that for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't hiding behind professional boundaries because he was afraid of complications. He was stepping beyond them because some complications were worth facing if it meant standing beside someone who fought for what mattered. The morning brought rain that turned the city gray and made construction sites into muddy obstacle courses where every step required calculation. Ethan arrived at the Harbor Point development before dawn, one of 3 projects Victoria had identified as showing the same suspicious patterns as Riverside. The site was supposed to be ahead of schedule and under budget, which according to Robert Caldwell's presentation to the board meant exceptional project management. According to Victoria's financial analysis, it meant corners were being cut in ways that wouldn't show up until buildings started failing. Ethan parked away from the main entrance, approaching on foot with his equipment bag and the careful anonymity of someone who belonged without demanding attention. The security guard waved him through after a cursory check of his credentials, and within minutes, Ethan was deep in the foundation sections that had supposedly been completed 2 weeks ahead of timeline. The concrete told its own story, if you knew how to read it. Ethan documented everything with photographs and measurements, building a technical record that would either support Victoria's suspicions or prove them wrong. By 9 a.m., he had enough evidence to know they were right about the scope of the fraud, and enough dread to understand how much worse this was going to get before it got better. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Call me when you're clear. Don't use your office." Ethan found a quiet corner of the construction trailer, checked that he was alone, and dialed her personal number. She picked up on the first ring, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Robert knows we're investigating him." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "How?" "I don't know yet, but I was called into the CEO's office 20 minutes ago and asked point blank whether I had assigned you to conduct unauthorized inspections of projects outside your normal portfolio. Someone told them you've been at 3 different sites this week, asking questions about work timelines and quality standards." "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That I asked you to verify compliance documentation for our upcoming regulatory review, which is within my authority as VP of Strategic Development. But they didn't buy it, or didn't want to buy it, which amounts to the same thing." Victoria paused, and Ethan heard papers rustling in the background. "They've restricted your site access effective immediately. Any inspections you want to conduct now require written approval from Robert Caldwell." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Robert couldn't prevent them from investigating without admitting there was something to find, but he could slow them down, control their access, and ensure they never gathered enough evidence to prove systematic fraud. And by routing approval through himself, he'd know exactly where they were looking and could adjust his documentation accordingly. "So, we're done," Ethan said flatly. "Without site access, I can't document the technical violations. Without technical documentation, you can't prove the financial discrepancies represent fraud rather than aggressive project management." "We're not done." Victoria's voice carried the steel he'd heard when she dealt with executives who underestimated her. "We're adapting. Robert thinks he's contained the threat by limiting your official access. He doesn't know about the evidence we've already gathered, and he doesn't know that I have other resources he hasn't considered." "What resources?" "You, for one. The restriction says you need written approval for official inspections. It doesn't say anything about you visiting construction sites as a private citizen interested in urban development. You take photographs from public sidewalks, you observe work from areas accessible to anyone, you document what's visible without trespassing or misrepresenting your purpose. That's a gray area at best. Everything about this situation is a gray area. The question is whether you're willing to operate in that space long enough to gather evidence that puts us on solid ground. She waited, letting him make the choice without pressure. I need to know if you're still committed to this, Ethan, because it's going to get harder before it gets easier, and I won't blame you if you decide the risk isn't worth it. Ethan thought about the concrete he'd inspected that morning, about foundations that looked solid, until you measured the aggregate density and realized they'd fail under sustained load. He thought about the people who would eventually occupy buildings constructed on Robert Caldwell's fraud, trusting that someone had ensured their safety. I'm still committed, he said. But Victoria, if Robert knows we're investigating, he's going to be preparing his defense, manufacturing explanations, destroying evidence, building alliances. We need to move faster than we planned. I know, which is why I'm accelerating the timeline. I need you to document everything you found this morning and send it to my personal email tonight. I'm meeting with the CEO again tomorrow, and I'm going to force a formal investigation whether Robert likes it or not. That's risky. If you don't have overwhelming evidence, I have enough to create reasonable doubt about Robert's management practices. And once there's an official investigation, he can't destroy evidence or manipulate documentation without committing additional crimes that are harder to hide. Victoria's tone softened slightly. Trust me on this. I've been navigating corporate politics long enough to know when to be patient and when to force the issue. This is a forcing moment. They ended the call with plans to meet that evening at the Grind to review Ethan's documentation and prepare for Victoria's meeting with the CEO. Ethan spent the rest of the morning compiling his findings into a report that was technically rigorous enough to withstand expert scrutiny while being clear enough for executives to understand the implications. By the time he finished, he had 17 pages of evidence proving that Robert Caldwell had overseen projects where documented work didn't match physical reality, where timelines made no sense, where safety standards had been compromised in ways that put lives at risk. His phone rang at 2 p.m. Marcus calling instead of texting, which meant either urgency or performance. Hale! Where have you been hiding? We haven't seen you at lunch all week, and you're dodging our messages about the dare. Clock's ticking, my friend. Friday deadline is tomorrow, and we're all wondering if you're actually going through with this or if you've been stringing us along. Ethan leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted by the gap between what Marcus thought was happening and what was actually at stake. I've been working, Marcus. Some of us have actual job responsibilities that don't involve gambling pools and corporate hazing. Ouch! Someone's touchy. Look, we're just having fun here. Nobody actually expects you to succeed with Victoria Kane. The whole point is watching you try, seeing how you handle rejection from someone that far out of your league. It's entertainment, Hale. Don't take it so seriously. And what happens if she doesn't reject me? The silence on Marcus's end stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from jovial to calculating. What are you saying? Did something happen? Because if you're telling me you actually got somewhere with her, I need details. The pool needs verification before we pay out. The pool can wait until Friday, Ethan said. I'll let you know how it goes. Come on, man. Don't leave us hanging. At least tell me whether you asked her out. Just that much. Did the words leave your mouth in some form resembling an invitation to dinner or drinks or anything that could qualify as a date? Ethan thought about Tuesday night at the Grind, about coffee and conspiracy and trust built in spaces designed for authenticity rather than performance. We've talked. Multiple times, things are developing. Marcus's laugh carried notes of disbelief and something darker. Things are developing. That's the most corporate non-answer I've ever heard. You know what? Forget Friday. We're all meeting at O'Malley's tonight after work. You're going to come, you're going to give us a full report on your romantic progress with the Ice Queen, and we're going to decide whether you've actually earned any of that pool money. I can't tonight. I have plans. Plans with Victoria? The question came too quick, too sharp, like Marcus had been waiting to ask it. Plans that don't involve giving you updates on my personal life for your entertainment. Your personal life is our entertainment, Hale. That was the whole point of the dare. You accepted the terms when you picked up that envelope. Marcus's voice hardened. Look, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing here, but people are starting to ask questions about why you're suddenly spending time with Victoria, about what you're really discussing in all those meetings, about whether maybe you're using this dare as cover for something else entirely. The accusation hung in the air, and Ethan understood with sudden clarity what was happening. Marcus hadn't created the dare to humiliate him. He'd created it to provide plausible explanation for any interaction between Ethan and Victoria that might be observed. If anyone saw them meeting outside the office, having coffee together, exchanging phone numbers, it could all be dismissed as Ethan pursuing a ridiculous bet rather than Victoria recruiting an ally to investigate corporate fraud. Who's asking questions, Marcus? People who pay attention to things like unauthorized site inspections and VPs having private meetings with junior consultants. People who might wonder if maybe you and Victoria are collaborating on something that isn't exactly in the company's best interests. You mean Robert Caldwell? The silence confirmed what Ethan had suspected. Marcus wasn't acting alone or even primarily for his own amusement. He was Robert's tool, deliberately or not, creating cover for surveillance while appearing to engage in nothing more than office politics and masculine posturing. I'm saying you should be careful, Marcus said finally, because if you're doing something that makes important people uncomfortable, a dare about asking out the VP is the least of your problems. Understand? I understand perfectly. Tell Robert that if he has concerns about my work, he's welcome to discuss them with me directly rather than using you as a messenger. Ethan ended the call before Marcus could respond, anger and adrenaline making his hands shake. The dare had never been about humiliation or entertainment or proving anything about his courage with women. It had been reconnaissance, a way to monitor his relationship with Victoria while maintaining the appearance of juvenile corporate games. And he'd walked right into it, providing exactly the cover story Robert needed to explain why a site consultant and a VP might be seen together outside normal business contexts. His phone buzzed immediately with a text from Victoria. Are you okay? I just got a very strange call from Marcus Chen asking about my dinner plans. Ethan dialed her number, dispensing with text messages when the situation required actual conversation. We've been compromised. Marcus just called fishing for information about us, claiming the dare deadline is tomorrow, but really trying to figure out what we're actually doing together. I know. He called me pretending to verify details about you asking me out, but the questions were too specific. He wanted to know whether we'd discussed anything work-related, whether you'd shared concerns about any projects, whether I'd given you assignments outside your normal scope. Victoria's voice carried controlled fury. Robert's using him as a proxy to gather intelligence without being directly involved. It's smart, actually. If Marcus gets caught spying, Robert can claim he had no knowledge of it. So what do we do? We use it. Marcus expects you to report on your progress with me. Fine. Give him something to report that's true enough to be believable, but incomplete enough to be useless. She paused, thinking through strategy with the speed of someone who'd spent years outmaneuvering men who underestimated her. Tell him you asked me to dinner. Tell him I said yes. Tell him we're meeting tomorrow night to discuss it further. Victoria, that's strategic. If Marcus and Robert think this is actually about romance, they'll focus on the wrong threat. They'll waste time trying to use your supposed interest in me as leverage or embarrassment rather than recognizing that we're building a fraud case against Robert that could end his career. Ethan understood the logic even as everything in him resisted using their actual partnership as cover for a fake relationship. And when they realize we're not actually dating, when the investigation goes public and they figure out the whole thing was strategic deception, by then we'll have evidence they can't refute and documentation they can't destroy. The truth about our professional collaboration won't matter compared to the truth about Robert's fraud. Victoria's voice softened slightly. I know this is uncomfortable. I know it goes against your instincts about maintaining boundaries and avoiding complications, but sometimes the way through a trap is deeper into it, not around it. You're asking me to lie about our relationship. I'm asking you to let them believe what they already suspect while we gather evidence to expose something that actually matters. The lie isn't us pretending to be romantically involved. The lie is Robert Caldwell presenting himself as a competent executive when he's actually stealing from the company and compromising structural safety. Ethan looked out his office window at the construction yard, where crews were building projects that might be constructed on the same fraudulent foundations he documented at Harbor Point. If we do this, if we let Marcus and Robert think this is about me asking you out, we need rules, clear boundaries about what's performance and what's real. Agreed. We meet when we need to for the investigation, which is real. If anyone asks, we're exploring whether there's potential for something more personal, which is strategically ambiguous. We don't fabricate romantic gestures or intimate details, but we don't deny interest either. We operate in the space between confirmation and denial until we have enough evidence to make the truth irrelevant. It was a plan that would have seemed impossibly complicated a week ago, before Ethan understood that sometimes integrity required operating in gray areas that corporate guidelines never addressed. Before he'd learned that the woman everyone called the Ice Queen was actually someone fighting a lonely battle against corruption while being undermined by the very system supposed to prevent it. "I'll talk to Marcus tonight," Ethan said. "I'll tell him enough to keep him satisfied and Robert distracted. But Victoria, we're running out of time. If Robert knows we're investigating, he's going to accelerate whatever endgame he has planned." "I know, which is why I'm meeting with the CEO tomorrow regardless of how much additional evidence we gather. I'll use what you documented at Harbor Point, combine it with my financial analysis, and force the issue." She hesitated, and Ethan heard uncertainty creep into her voice for the first time. "There's a chance this backfires. A chance the CEO sides with Robert, dismisses the evidence as inconclusive, and I end up looking like I'm pursuing a personal vendetta. And if that happens, then we take everything we have to regulatory authorities and let them conduct their own investigation. It'll mean the end of my career at this company, probably yours too. But at least we'll have done the right thing." Victoria exhaled slowly. "I've made peace with that possibility. I need to know you have too." Ethan thought about 7 years of careful career management, of boundaries maintained and complications avoided, of professional success built on never taking risks that might compromise his position. He thought about how small those achievements seemed compared to what Victoria was willing to sacrifice for something that actually mattered. "I'm ready," he said. "Whatever happens, we see this through." They finalized plans to meet at the grind at 7. Then Ethan forced himself to call Marcus back and deliver the performance that would keep Robert's attention focused on the wrong threat. Marcus answered on the first ring, his eagerness barely disguised. "Hale, reconsider joining us tonight?" "No, but I wanted to update you on the dare since you're so invested in the outcome." Ethan kept his voice casual, like discussing whether a sports team had won or lost. "I asked Victoria to dinner. She said yes. We're meeting tomorrow night to see where things go." The silence on Marcus's end lasted several seconds too long. "You're serious? You actually asked Victoria Kane on a date, and she agreed?" "Seems that way." "When? How? What exactly did you say?" The questions came rapid fire, and Ethan recognized the sound of someone taking notes, probably planning to report every detail to Robert within the hour. "We ran into each other getting coffee. I asked if she'd be interested in dinner sometime. She said she'd consider it if I could have an actual conversation that wasn't about work. So we talked for a while, and by the end she suggested tomorrow night." Ethan added just enough detail to make it believable while keeping it vague enough to prevent verification. "Not sure where it's going, but I figured that counts toward your dare conditions." "It counts," Marcus said slowly. "It definitely counts. Though I've got to say, Hale, I didn't think you had it in you. Victoria Kane doesn't date colleagues, doesn't mix professional and personal. Half the executives in this company have tried to get her attention over the past year, and she shut down every single one. Maybe they weren't asking the right way. Or maybe there's more to this than you're telling me." Marcus's tone shifted, becoming speculative. "See, the thing is, Victoria doesn't just agree to dinner with random consultants, no matter how politely they ask. She's deliberate about everything, calculating. So either you're the luckiest man alive, or she has reasons for saying yes that have nothing to do with romance." "Guess I'll find out tomorrow night." "Yeah, guess you will." Marcus paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of warning. "Just be careful, Hale. Victoria Kane is smart, ambitious, and very good at using people to achieve her goals. If she's spending time with you, it's because she wants something. Make sure you know what that something is before you get in too deep. The irony of receiving relationship advice from someone actively spying for a corrupt executive wasn't lost on Ethan, but he kept his response neutral. I appreciate the concern. I'll let you know how it goes. He ended the call feeling like he'd just passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The performance had been convincing enough to satisfy Marcus's curiosity, while vague enough to prevent useful intelligence gathering. Robert would hear that Ethan and Victoria were meeting for dinner, would assume it was personal rather than professional, and would hopefully underestimate the threat they represented until too late. The afternoon crawled past with emails and routine work that felt absurd given everything else happening. Ethan reviewed project timelines, approved contractor invoices, responded to questions from site supervisors, all while thinking about the evidence sitting in his locked desk drawer that could destroy a senior vice president's career, or end his own, depending on how the next 48 hours played out. At 6:30, he packed his laptop and the documentation he'd prepared for Victoria, then drove to the grind through traffic that seemed heavier than usual. The coffee shop was crowded with the after-work crowd, people seeking caffeine or connection or brief respite from corporate existence. Ethan found their corner table unoccupied and claimed it with the territorial certainty of someone who'd come to think of this space as neutral ground in a war most people didn't know was being fought. Victoria arrived at 7 exactly, wearing business casual that suggested she'd come straight from the office. She ordered her usual black coffee, settled into the chair across from Ethan, and for a moment they just looked at each other with the shared understanding of people about to commit to something irreversible. I talked to Marcus, Ethan said. Told him I asked you to dinner. You said yes. We're meeting tomorrow night. He's definitely reporting to Robert. Good. That should keep them focused on the wrong thing. Victoria pulled out her tablet, opening files with practiced efficiency. Show me what you found at Harbor Point. They spent the next hour reviewing Ethan's documentation, Victoria making notes and asking questions that revealed her understanding of both technical specifications and legal implications. The evidence was damning: concrete that didn't meet density requirements, rebar placement that violated code, work timelines that made no mathematical sense. Combined with Victoria's financial analysis showing payment discrepancies across multiple projects, it painted a picture of systematic fraud that had been operating for at least 18 months. This is enough, Victoria said finally. Not enough to guarantee conviction in criminal court, but enough to force the board to conduct a formal investigation. Once that starts, Robert's ability to destroy evidence or manipulate documentation becomes severely limited. When are you presenting it? Tomorrow afternoon. I've scheduled a meeting with the CEO and the board chairman under the pretext of discussing strategic development priorities. I'll use the first 10 minutes to present our findings, then let them decide whether they want to risk the liability of ignoring credible evidence of fraud. Ethan heard the steel underneath her calm delivery and understood she'd done this before, had walked into rooms full of powerful men and demanded they take her seriously despite every incentive to dismiss her concerns. You don't sound nervous. I'm terrified, Victoria said simply. But I learned a long time ago that showing fear in corporate environments is the fastest way to lose credibility. So I'm terrified quietly, in private, where it can't be used against me. The admission carried a vulnerability Ethan hadn't expected, a crack in the professional armor that revealed the human being underneath. For what it's worth, I think you're probably the bravest person I've ever met. Most people wouldn't risk their career to expose fraud. They'd tell themselves it's not their responsibility, or that someone else will deal with it, or that the system will eventually correct itself. The system doesn't correct itself, Victoria said. The system protects itself, which means protecting the people who benefit from its dysfunction. Change only happens when someone refuses to accept corruption as the cost of doing business. She met his eyes. The question is whether we have enough courage to be those people when it costs us everything we've built. I think we're about to find out. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of tomorrow's meeting settling over them. Around them, the coffee shop buzzed with ordinary conversation. People discussing weekend plans and office politics and all the small dramas that filled lives lived within acceptable boundaries. Ethan wondered what they'd think if they knew 2 people in the corner table were planning to blow up a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme that would make headlines and end careers and potentially send a senior executive to prison. Can I ask you something? Victoria said, her tone shifting from strategic to genuinely curious. Why did you really accept Marcus's dare? I know what you told him about asking me to dinner, but what was the actual reason you picked up that envelope instead of walking away? Ethan considered deflecting, maintaining the professional distance that had served him for 7 years. Then he remembered Victoria's comment about needing honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, and chose truth over safety. I picked it up because Marcus wanted me to refuse it. I saw it in his expression. He was expecting me to decline, and he had responses prepared for that outcome, which meant the dare itself was secondary to my reaction to it. So I picked it up to see what trap I was walking into. And once you read it? Once you knew they wanted you to ask me out? I thought it was stupid and insulting, reducing a respected executive to a bet for entertainment. I thought about reporting it to HR and watching the whole thing blow up in their faces. Ethan paused, remembering the anger he'd felt. But then you called me to your office about the Riverside project, and I realized the dare might be connected to something larger. When you asked me to investigate Robert, I understood that Marcus's dare wasn't random. It was deliberate positioning, creating cover for why you and I might be seen together. Victoria nodded slowly. Robert's smarter than people give him credit for. He recognized that I might try to recruit allies to investigate his activities, so he created plausible alternative explanations for any partnerships I might form. If you and I are seen having coffee or meeting outside the office, it's not about fraud investigation. It's just a consultant pursuing a ridiculous dare. Which is why you want me to actually take you to dinner tomorrow. Make it real enough that the cover story holds. Yes, and also because... Victoria hesitated, choosing words carefully. Also because in the middle of fighting corporate corruption and risking our careers, it might be nice to have one evening that's actually what it appears to be. Dinner between two people who've chosen to trust each other despite every reason not to. The suggestion hung between them, complicated and genuine, an acknowledgement that somewhere in the strategic deception and fraud investigation, something real had developed. Not romance, necessarily, though Ethan couldn't deny the attraction he felt toward someone who fought with such integrity. But connection, certainly. Partnership built on shared values and mutual respect and willingness to sacrifice for principles that mattered. "Where would you like to go?" Ethan asked. Victoria smiled, and the expression transformed her face from intimidating executive to someone Ethan wanted to know beyond professional context. "Surprise me. Somewhere that isn't about impressing anyone or maintaining appearances. Just good food and honest conversation." "I can do that." They finalized the logistics. Ethan would pick her up at 7. They'd go somewhere Marcus and his surveillance network were unlikely to follow. They'd have an actual evening that served dual purposes of strategic cover and authentic human connection. When Victoria left, Ethan sat alone in the grind for another hour, drinking coffee that had gone cold and thinking about the next day's meeting that would either vindicate their investigation or destroy their careers. His phone buzzed at 9 p.m. Victoria, texting from what he assumed was home based on the casual tone. "Thank you for agreeing to this. Both the investigation and the dinner. I know it's complicated and potentially disastrous, but I'd rather fail trying to do the right thing with someone I trust than succeed by compromising with someone I don't." Ethan read the message 3 times, hearing all the things Victoria couldn't say directly. That she'd been fighting alone for a long time. That having an ally mattered more than she'd expected. That whatever happened tomorrow, she was glad he'd chosen to stand beside her. He typed a response that tried to match her honesty. "I spent 7 years avoiding complications because I thought safety was the same as integrity. You've shown me they're not. Whatever happens, I'm grateful you trusted me with this." The reply came within seconds. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be intense." Ethan tried to follow that advice, but sleep came slowly, his mind replaying scenarios for Victoria's meeting with the CEO and board chairman. Best case, they took the evidence seriously and launched a formal investigation that would expose Robert's fraud. Worst case, they sided with Robert, dismissed Victoria's concerns as overreach or personal vendetta, and both their careers ended in professional disgrace. Most likely case fell somewhere between those extremes, partial acknowledgement of problems combined with efforts to contain damage and protect the company's reputation. The real question was whether they'd gathered enough evidence to make containment impossible, or whether Robert's connections and strategic positioning would let him survive accusations that should end anyone's career. Ethan drifted into restless sleep thinking about foundations built on fraud, about structures that looked solid until you measured them properly, about the moment when truth became too overwhelming to ignore regardless of how inconvenient it was. His alarm went off at 6 a.m., dragging him from dreams of collapsing buildings and buried evidence. He dressed with mechanical precision, choosing clothes that projected competence without trying too hard, then drove to the office through morning traffic that seemed oblivious to the fact that today might change everything. Victoria's meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., which left 8 hours of pretending to work, while actually counting down to the moment when they'd know whether courage and integrity were enough to overcome corruption and power. At 1:30, Ethan received a text. Meeting moved up to 1 p.m. CEO wants this dealt with before board session tonight. Wish me luck. He typed back immediately. You don't need luck. You have truth and evidence. That's better. The response came as Ethan was staring at his phone, willing it to deliver good news. We're about to find out. The next 2 hours passed in agonizing silence. Ethan tried to focus on work, reviewing contractor bids and project timelines, but his attention kept drifting to his phone, waiting for updates that didn't come. At 3 p.m., he gave up pretending productivity was possible and walked to the window overlooking the construction yard, watching crews build structures he hoped weren't compromised by the same fraud he'd documented. His phone finally rang at 3:40. Victoria, her voice tight with controlled emotion. We need to talk, not here. The parking structure, level 5, southwest corner, 15 minutes. She hung up before Ethan could respond, leaving him with nothing but the certainty that something had gone very wrong or very right. And either way, his life was about to change in ways he couldn't predict. He grabbed his keys and headed for the parking structure, taking stairs instead of elevators because waiting for doors to open felt impossible when Victoria's voice had carried that particular combination of urgency and barely restrained fury. Level 5 was mostly empty this time of day, and Ethan found her standing beside her car in the southwest corner, exactly where she'd specified, looking like someone who'd just survived a battle they hadn't expected to win. What happened? Ethan asked. Victoria turned to face him, and her expression carried triumph mixed with something darker. I presented the evidence, all of it. Your technical documentation, my financial analysis, the timeline showing systematic fraud across multiple projects. I gave them everything we had, professionally formatted, legally documented, impossible to dismiss as speculation or personal vendetta. And they're launching a formal investigation, full forensic audit of Robert's projects, independent structural assessments of completed work, legal review of all contractor relationships and payment schedules. Victoria's voice carried savage satisfaction. Robert tried to discredit the evidence, claimed I was misinterpreting normal construction variations, suggested I had personal motivations for targeting him. But I documented everything so thoroughly that his explanations sounded like exactly what they were, desperate lies from someone caught. That's incredible. Victoria, that's exactly what we hoped for. It is, but there's a complication. She met his eyes, and Ethan saw the cost of her victory written in the tension around her mouth. The CEO made it clear that while they're investigating Robert, they're also investigating me, questioning whether I exceeded my authority by recruiting you to conduct unofficial inspections, suggesting that my methods were questionable even if my conclusions prove accurate. That's insane. You were trying to expose fraud. I was trying to expose fraud by using tactics that bent corporate protocols and potentially compromised professional boundaries, and now I'm being held to the same standard I demanded they apply to Robert. Absolute adherence to policy, regardless of motivation. Victoria's laugh was bitter. It's actually brilliant strategy. They get to investigate the fraud I exposed while also investigating me for exposing it, which means, whatever happens, they maintain control of the narrative. Ethan understood the trap immediately. If the investigation proved Robert's fraud, the company could claim credit for taking decisive action while also punishing Victoria for the methods she'd used to discover it. If the investigation somehow exonerated Robert, they could blame Victoria for creating unnecessary controversy through overzealous interpretation of evidence. Either way, her career at this company was effectively over. I'm sorry, he said, the words inadequate for everything she'd sacrificed. Don't be. I knew this was possible. Probable, even. Victoria straightened her shoulders, and Ethan saw the steel that had carried her through 20 years in an industry designed to break people like her. The investigation will prove Robert committed fraud. The evidence is too overwhelming for any other conclusion. And when it does, when his crimes become public record, the fact that I bent some protocols to expose them will seem trivial in comparison. And if it doesn't, if somehow they find a way to protect him, then we take everything to the authorities and let them conduct their own investigation. But either way, Ethan, we did the right thing. We exposed corruption that was putting lives at risk. That has to count for something. She said it with conviction, but Ethan heard the uncertainty underneath, the question she couldn't quite ask. Was doing the right thing worth the cost if it destroyed everything you'd built? He didn't have an answer that would satisfy either of them. So instead he said, I'm still taking you to dinner tonight. Strategic cover story or not, you've earned an evening that isn't about fraud and investigations and corporate politics. Victoria studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from professional armor to genuine warmth. Pick me up at 7. And Ethan, thank you for standing with me when it would have been easier to walk away. Thank you for giving me something worth standing for. They parted with the understanding that tonight's dinner had become more important than either of them had expected, a small island of normalcy and chaos that threatened to consume everything around it. Ethan drove home through afternoon traffic, his mind already working through restaurant options that would provide privacy without appearing like they had something to hide. By the time 7 p.m. arrived, he'd chosen a small Italian place in a neighborhood neither of them frequented, somewhere authentic and quiet, where they could talk without performing for anyone's benefit. He picked up Victoria from her apartment, a modest space that somehow surprised him with its normality. Books on shelves, art on walls, evidence of a life lived beyond corporate warfare. She wore a simple dress that transformed her from intimidating executive to someone Ethan wanted to know, in context that had nothing to do with construction fraud or professional boundaries. They drove to the restaurant making conversation that carefully avoided the investigation, talking instead about books and cities and the small details that made up actual lives. The restaurant delivered exactly what Ethan had hoped. Good food, dim lighting, corners where conversations could unfold naturally. They ordered wine and pasta, and somewhere between the first course and second, the evening stopped being about strategic cover and became simply two people enjoying each other's company. Can I ask you something? Victoria said as they finished dinner. And I want an honest answer, not a professional one. Of course. If Marcus hadn't created that dare, if circumstances hadn't forced us into this investigation partnership, would you have ever talked to me beyond professional necessity? Ethan considered lying, offering some polite deflection that would preserve dignity. Then he remembered Victoria's insistence on honesty even when uncomfortable, and chose truth. Probably not. You intimidated me, not because you were cold or unapproachable, but because you represented everything I'd convinced myself I didn't want. Complications, risks, connections that might compromise carefully maintained boundaries. It was easier to admire you from professional distance than to actually know you. And now? Now I realize I was confusing safety with integrity, isolation with strength. You've shown me that the most important things worth doing are usually the ones that scare us most. He met her eyes. So no, I probably wouldn't have approached you on my own, but I'm grateful circumstances forced the issue because knowing you is worth every complication it's created. Victoria smiled, genuine and unguarded. That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me in years. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear, or what serves their agenda, or what maintains professional courtesy. You just told me the truth. You asked for it. I did. And I'm asking for something else now. She reached across the table, her hand settling over his. Whatever happens with the investigation, whatever consequences we face for exposing Robert's fraud, I want you to know that this, tonight, this conversation, this connection, matters more to me than any career outcome. I'd rather lose my position doing the right thing with someone I trust than keep it by compromising with people I don't. Ethan turned his hand to interlock their fingers, the gesture feeling both natural and momentous. Then we face whatever comes together. No hiding, no hedging, no pretending this is just strategic performance. Together, Victoria agreed. They left the restaurant as the rain that had threatened all day finally began. Light drops that promised to become something more substantial. Ethan drove Victoria home through streets that gleamed with reflected light, and when they reached her apartment, she didn't immediately get out. "The CEO called while we were at dinner," she said quietly. "They've suspended Robert pending the investigation. Full administrative leave, no access to company systems or projects. His allies are already mobilizing to defend him, but the evidence is too damning. It's happening, Ethan. We actually did it." "We did it," he confirmed, understanding that this was the beginning rather than the end, that the fight would get uglier before resolution came. Victoria leaned across the console, and when she kissed him, it carried gratitude and trust, and the fierce determination of someone who'd chosen to stand for something that mattered regardless of cost. Ethan kissed her back, no longer hiding behind professional boundaries or careful distance, committed now to seeing this through wherever it led. When they finally separated, Victoria smiled in the darkness. Friday at 5 p.m. That was Marcus's deadline for the dare, right? It was. Then I guess you win the bet. Against all odds, the junior consultant asked out the untouchable VP, and she said yes. Her expression turned mischievous. "Want to collect your winnings?" "I think I already have," Ethan said. He watched her walk to her apartment, waiting until she was safely inside before driving home through rain that was definitely going to turn into a storm. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Board meeting ran late. Everyone's talking about Victoria's presentation. Robert's suspended. What the hell is happening?" Ethan typed back, "The truth. Finally." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain, didn't offer Marcus the satisfaction of details. The dare had stopped mattering the moment it became clear it was cover for something far more important than office entertainment. Tomorrow would bring consequences neither of them could fully predict. Robert's allies would fight back, corporate politics would get uglier, and the investigation would expose things people had worked hard to keep hidden. But tonight, Ethan had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stop hiding behind professional boundaries and start standing beside someone who fought for what mattered. The storm broke as he reached home, rain hammering against windows, while wind rattled structures built on foundations he hoped were more solid than the ones Robert Caldwell had compromised. Ethan stood at his window watching the city weather the storm, thinking about integrity under pressure and the way truth emerged when you refused to look away from it. His phone buzzed one final time. Victoria, her message simple and devastating in its honesty. "Thank you for tonight, for being honest when it was easier to hide, for standing with me when it would have cost less to walk away. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you gave me something I didn't know I needed. Partnership built on trust instead of protocol." Ethan read the message twice, then typed a response that matched her vulnerability. "Whatever happens, we face it together. No more hiding behind professional distance. No more pretending connection is weakness. We chose this path. Now we see it through." The storm raged outside while Ethan sat in darkness, committed now to a future that would either vindicate their courage or destroy their careers. But for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't afraid of complications or consequences. He was ready to fight for something that mattered, standing beside someone worth fighting for. And that, he realized, was what integrity under pressure actually meant. The storm hadn't finished by morning. Rain continued to hammer the city in sheets that turned streets into rivers and made the construction yards look like disaster zones waiting to happen. Ethan arrived at the office before 7, expecting the fallout from Victoria's presentation to have generated overnight chaos that would require immediate damage control. What he found instead was silence so complete it felt deliberately constructed. The hallways were emptier than usual for a Friday morning. The few colleagues he passed avoided eye contact with the precision of people who'd been warned that association carried risk. Marcus's desk sat unoccupied, coffee mug cold, computer dark. The conference room where they'd started this whole mess with a dare and an envelope remained locked, lights off, as if the building itself had decided certain spaces were too contaminated for normal use. Ethan's phone had 17 missed calls by the time he reached his office, most from numbers he didn't recognize, 3 from Victoria, 1 from a 202 area code that made his stomach drop, because Washington, D.C. at 7 a.m. meant federal authorities taking interest in construction fraud allegations. He called Victoria first, needing to hear her voice before dealing with whatever legal complications were about to consume his day. She answered on the first ring, her voice carrying the brittle edge of someone who hadn't slept. "Where are you?" "My office. Where are you?" "Home. They've asked me not to come in until the investigation team has finished their initial review. Corporate speak for, we're deciding whether to fire you immediately or wait until we've extracted everything useful first." Victoria's laugh held no humor. The forensic auditors arrived at 6 a.m. They've locked down Robert's office, seized his computers, and started interviewing everyone who worked on the projects we flagged. It's happening faster than I expected. That's good, right? Fast investigation means they're taking it seriously. Fast investigation means they want it contained before it becomes public. The board meeting last night apparently went badly for Robert. 3 members called for his immediate termination, 2 wanted to wait for investigation results. 1 suggested we were overreacting to normal construction variations. But the consensus was that, whether he's guilty or not, the optics of a VP suspended for fraud allegations are terrible for the company. Ethan heard what she wasn't saying directly. The company cared more about managing perception than pursuing truth, which meant their investigation would focus as much on controlling narrative as determining facts. "Have the auditors contacted you yet?" "Twice. Once to confirm the documentation I submitted was accurate and complete. Once to ask pointed questions about why I recruited you specifically to conduct inspections rather than using official channels." Victoria paused, and Ethan heard papers rustling. "They're building a timeline of our investigation. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision to circumvent normal protocols. They want to know if we followed proper procedures or if we let personal motivations compromise professional judgment." Personal motivations meaning the fact that we're, what exactly? Dating? Partners? Collaborating on fraud exposure while also having dinner together? All of the above, apparently. Someone leaked information about your dare to ask me out. The auditors have a copy of the original envelope, witness statements from Marcus and his gambling pool, documentation of every time we met outside the office. Victoria's voice went flat. "They're building a case that our investigation was compromised by romantic involvement that clouded professional judgment. Classic character assassination. Admit fraud might exist, but question the credibility of people who exposed it." Ethan felt rage building in his chest, the kind that came from watching injustice disguise itself as due process. That's insane. The evidence stands regardless of our relationship status. Robert either committed fraud or he didn't, and the technical documentation proves he did. You're thinking like an engineer. Think like a lawyer. If they can establish that our judgment was compromised, they can argue the investigation was flawed from inception, which means they can settle quietly with Robert, avoid regulatory scrutiny, and make this whole thing disappear while blaming us for creating unnecessary drama through unprofessional conduct. So what do? We stick to the truth. Yes, we developed a personal relationship during the investigation. No, that relationship didn't compromise our professional judgment or the accuracy of our findings. The evidence speaks for itself. Concrete that doesn't meet specifications, timelines that don't make mathematical sense, financial discrepancies that reveal systematic fraud. Victoria's voice hardened. And if they try to bury this because it's inconvenient, we go public. Media, regulatory authorities, anyone who will listen to a story about corporate fraud and the company that tried to cover it up. That would destroy your career permanently. My career is already destroyed. The question is whether I take down a corrupt system with me or let it survive to victimize the next person who tries to do the right thing. She exhaled slowly. "I'm meeting with the auditors again at 10. They want to walk through my entire relationship with you from first contact to yesterday's presentation. Every detail, every conversation, every decision we made. Should I be there?" They're interviewing us separately, standard procedure to check for inconsistencies in our stories. Which means we need to be absolutely truthful about everything, because if they catch us in a lie, even a small one, they'll use it to discredit the entire investigation. Ethan thought about the careful performance they'd conducted for Marcus and Robert's benefit, the strategic ambiguity about whether their relationship was professional or personal, the deliberate blurring of boundaries to maintain cover for their investigation. "Victoria, we did lie. Maybe not about the evidence or the technical findings, but about our motivations, our relationship, what we were really doing when we met outside the office." We adapted to a hostile environment where telling the complete truth would have compromised our ability to gather evidence. That's different from fabricating findings or manipulating data. Victoria paused. Look, I know this is complicated. I know we're going to face questions that don't have clean answers, but the foundation of everything we did was solid. We documented real fraud using legitimate methods. Everything else is just context. A knock on Ethan's office door interrupted before he could respond. He turned to find two people he didn't recognize standing in his doorway. A woman in her 40s carrying a briefcase that screamed legal authority, and a man slightly younger with the careful neutrality of someone trained to reveal nothing through expression. Mr. Hale? I'm Jennifer Walsh, and this is David Chen. We're with the forensic audit team investigating the allegations Ms. Kane presented to the board. We need to speak with you about your role in the investigation. Jennifer's voice was professionally pleasant in the way that suggested cooperating was optional only in the most technical sense. I need to go, Ethan said to Victoria. The auditors just arrived. Remember, complete honesty about everything that matters. Don't volunteer information they don't ask for, but don't lie about anything that affects the validity of our findings. Victoria's voice softened slightly. And Ethan, thank you for everything. She disconnected before he could respond, leaving him facing two auditors who were already evaluating him with the clinical detachment of people trained to spot deception in breathing patterns and word choice. Of course, Ethan said to Jennifer. Would you like to use the conference room? Your office is fine. We prefer informal settings for initial conversations. People tend to be more forthcoming when they're comfortable. Jennifer settled into one of his visitor chairs while David positioned himself by the window, tablet ready to record whatever was about to unfold. Let's start with a simple question. When did you first become aware of potential fraud in the Riverside project? The interrogation lasted 3 hours. Jennifer asked questions with surgical precision, building a timeline of Ethan's investigation from his first inspection report through yesterday's presentation. She wanted dates, times, specific conversations, every decision he'd made about where to look and what to document. David took notes with the mechanical efficiency of someone capturing evidence for eventual legal proceedings, occasionally interjecting clarifying questions that suggested he understood construction specifications well enough to evaluate Ethan's technical conclusions. Ethan stuck to facts, describing his inspection methodology, the discrepancies he'd found, the documentation he'd provided to Victoria. When Jennifer asked about his relationship with Victoria, he was honest. They'd developed trust and respect through working together. That trust had evolved into something personal, but neither the trust nor the personal connection had compromised the technical accuracy of his findings. Let's talk about the dare, Jennifer said, producing a photocopy of the envelope Marcus had slid across the conference table a week ago. Marcus Chen states that you accepted a challenge to ask Ms. Kane on a romantic date, with money riding on the outcome. Is that accurate? The dare existed, yes. I picked up the envelope because I was curious what they'd come up with. And did you ask Ms. Kane to dinner, as the dare specified? Ethan met Jennifer's eyes steadily, recognizing the trap. If he said yes, she'd argue his entire relationship with Victoria was built on fulfilling a bet for money. If he said no, she'd catch him in a provable lie, since multiple people could confirm he'd told Marcus about asking Victoria out. I asked Victoria to dinner as part of our investigation strategy. We needed cover for meeting outside the office without raising questions about what we were really discussing. The dare provided that cover. So you used a dare created by colleagues as strategic deception to facilitate an unauthorized investigation into a senior vice president. Jennifer made a note. Did it occur to you that this approach might compromise your professional integrity? What occurred to me was that Robert Caldwell was committing fraud that put lives at risk, and normal reporting channels weren't going to expose it because he'd spent years building systems to protect himself. So yes, I used unconventional methods to gather evidence, but the evidence itself is completely valid regardless of how I obtained it. That's not for you to determine, Mr. Hale. That's for this investigation to establish based on a thorough review of your methodology and potential bias. Jennifer stood, signaling the interview was concluding. We'll need access to all your documentation, inspection reports, photographs, measurements, communication records with Ms. Kane, everything related to the projects you investigated. Of course. I'll have it compiled by end of day. We'll need it within the hour. This investigation is moving on an accelerated timeline. Jennifer moved toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. Have you had any contact with media outlets, regulatory authorities, or external parties regarding these allegations? No. Good. I strongly advise you to maintain that position. Discussing ongoing investigations with external parties could be considered interference with corporate procedures and might result in immediate termination. She delivered the threat with the same professional pleasantness she'd used for every other question. We'll be in touch if we need additional clarification. They left, taking the oxygen from the room with them. Ethan sat in silence, understanding that he'd just been warned that speaking publicly about the fraud would cost him his job while being assured that staying silent would protect him from consequences. It was elegant manipulation. Use the threat of termination to ensure cooperation while conducting an investigation designed more to protect the company than pursue truth. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. How did it go? About as well as expected. They want all my documentation within the hour, warned me against talking to media or regulators, and strongly implied my career depends on cooperating with their investigation rather than pursuing independent verification. Same here. Classic containment strategy. They'll review our evidence, admit some problems existed, implement corrective measures, and quietly settle with Robert to avoid criminal charges or regulatory scrutiny. Can they actually do that? Just make this disappear despite overwhelming evidence of fraud? They can if we let them. The question is whether we're willing to accept that outcome or whether we're prepared to force the issue by taking this public. Ethan stared at Victoria's message, understanding the choice she was presenting. They could cooperate with the investigation, accept whatever sanitized conclusions the auditors produced, and probably keep their jobs in some diminished capacity. Or they could go public with everything they'd found, force regulatory investigation, and guarantee their careers at this company were finished while ensuring Robert couldn't simply buy his way out of consequences. Before he could respond, his office phone rang, an internal extension he didn't immediately recognize. He picked up warily. Mr. Hale, this is Robert Caldwell. I think we should talk. The voice was smooth, confident, carrying none of the panic Ethan would have expected from someone suspended pending fraud investigation. If anything, Robert sounded almost amused, like a chess player who'd recognized his opponent's strategy and was ready to counter it. I'm not sure that's appropriate given the ongoing investigation. Oh, I think it's very appropriate. See, I've spent the morning reviewing the evidence you and Victoria compiled, and I have to admit it's impressive work. Thorough documentation, solid technical analysis, compelling financial discrepancies. Under different circumstances, I'd be recommending you for promotion. Under different circumstances, you wouldn't have been committing the fraud I documented. Robert laughed, genuine and warm. That's what I like about you, Hale. No political dancing, no corporate doublespeak, just direct honesty. It's refreshing, even when it's aimed at destroying my career. His tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. Here's the situation. The board is going to complete their investigation, find that some irregularities occurred under my oversight, implement new quality control procedures, and quietly ask me to resign with a generous severance package. In return, I'll sign agreements preventing me from discussing internal company matters or pursuing legal action. And you're telling me this because I want you to understand that this ends one way regardless of what you and Victoria do next. I walk away wealthy and connected enough to land somewhere else within 6 months. The company avoids regulatory scrutiny and criminal liability, and you two get to feel morally superior while watching your careers stall because nobody trusts employees who investigate their supervisors. Ethan felt his hands tighten on the phone. You're offering me something in exchange for backing down. I'm offering you reality. You exposed fraud, congratulations. You showed integrity and courage and all those other qualities people claim to value right up until they become inconvenient. But the system you're fighting is bigger than both of us, and it protects itself by making examples of people who challenge it too effectively. Robert paused. So here's what I'm offering. Walk away now, accept that you did your duty by reporting what you found, and I'll make sure the board knows you were a valuable asset who deserves advancement rather than punishment. Keep pushing, and I'll ensure your career here ends not with principled termination, but with quiet destruction, reassignments to projects nobody wants. performance reviews that suddenly find you lacking, opportunities that mysteriously evaporate. You can't do that while suspended. I have 15 years of relationships in this company and this industry. I can do more suspended than you can do with full authority, because I understand how power actually works. Robert's voice carried absolute certainty. Think about it, Hale. You've already won. Fraud exposed, corrupt executive removed, justice theoretically served. Don't destroy yourself by demanding punishment that the system isn't designed to deliver. The line went dead, leaving Ethan staring at his phone and feeling the trap closing around him. Robert was right about one thing. The system was designed to protect itself, which meant protecting the people who made it profitable even when they cut corners or broke laws. Fighting that system required willingness to sacrifice everything, and Ethan wasn't sure anymore whether his courage extended that far. He texted Victoria. Robert called. He's offering to smooth my career path if I back down from pushing for criminal charges, threatening destruction if I keep fighting. The response came within seconds. He called me too with the same offer. Classic pressure strategy. Make us think the fight is already lost, so we'll accept compromise instead of demanding accountability. Is it lost? Be honest with me, Victoria. Can we actually win this, or are we just deciding how much to lose? The pause before her response felt weighted with everything they'd risked, everything they stood to lose, everything that had seemed worth fighting for a day ago. When her message finally arrived, it carried the stark clarity of someone who'd already made her choice. Meet me at the grind in an hour. We need to decide together what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're not willing to accept. This is too important to decide alone. Ethan spent the next hour compiling his documentation for the auditors while his mind worked through scenarios that all ended badly in different ways. Cooperate with the investigation, accept sanitized conclusions. Keep his job, but lose his integrity. Fight publicly, force regulatory scrutiny, lose his job, but maintain principles. Find some middle path that preserved both career and conscience, though he couldn't imagine what that path would look like given the binary choice Robert had presented. The rain had softened to drizzle by the time he reached the grind, though the sky remained gray and threatening. Victoria was already there, sitting at their corner table with 2 untouched coffees going cold. She looked exhausted in ways that went beyond missed sleep, like someone who'd been fighting too long against opposition too entrenched to overcome through individual effort. Tell me honestly, Ethan said as he sat down. Can we actually win this? Victoria studied him for a long moment before responding. Define winning. If winning means Robert goes to prison and the company faces criminal charges for systematic fraud, probably not. The board will settle, implement reforms, make this disappear through legal mechanisms designed specifically for that purpose. But if winning means the fraud gets exposed publicly, regulatory authorities investigate even if the company tries to prevent it, and future executives think twice before cutting corners because they've seen the consequences, then yes, we can win that. At what cost? Our careers at this company, certainly. Probably our reputations in this industry for however long Robert's allies decide to make us toxic. Years of rebuilding professional credibility while watching him land somewhere else and continue doing exactly what we tried to stop. Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee cup without drinking. I won't lie to you, Ethan. This is going to hurt. It's going to cost us more than feels fair given that we did the right thing. But the alternative is accepting that corruption wins because fighting it costs too much. Ethan thought about the buildings constructed on fraudulent foundations, about the people who would eventually occupy spaces built with compromised structural integrity. He thought about Robert's offer, about the pragmatic calculation that said one man's career wasn't worth destroying your own future. And he thought about Victoria, who'd risked everything to expose fraud because some things mattered more than career advancement. I'm not walking away, he said. Robert's wrong about the system being unchangeable. Systems only stay corrupt when people accept corruption as the price of participation. We can change that, even if it costs us everything. Victoria's expression shifted from exhaustion to something that might have been hope. You're certain? Because once we go public, once we contact regulatory authorities and media outlets, there's no walking back. We'll be committed to seeing this through regardless of consequences. I'm certain. Ethan reached across the table, taking her hand. You asked me last night if I would have approached you without Marcus's dare forcing the issue. The honest answer was no. But I'm approaching this fight with absolute clarity and no external pressure. I choose this. I choose standing beside you against a system that needs to change, and I choose accepting whatever consequences come from that choice. For the first time since the investigation began, Victoria's professional armor cracked completely, revealing vulnerabilities she'd kept carefully hidden. I've been fighting alone for so long. 20 years of proving I belonged, of being better than everyone who doubted me, of maintaining boundaries so rigid that nobody could use my humanity against me. I didn't expect to find someone willing to stand with me when it actually mattered. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens next, we face it together. They sat in silence for a moment, holding hands across a coffee shop table while making decisions that would alter the trajectory of their lives. Around them, ordinary people lived ordinary days, discussing ordinary problems that didn't involve exposing corporate fraud or sacrificing careers for principles. Ethan wondered what they'd think if they knew two people in the corner were about to declare war on a system designed to crush exactly that kind of resistance. "So, what's our move?" he asked finally. Victoria pulled out her phone, opening a contact list that included names Ethan didn't recognize. "I've been preparing for this possibility since I first discovered Robert's fraud. I have connections at the SEC, contacts in investigative journalism, relationships with regulatory authorities who actually take construction safety seriously. We give them everything: documentation, financial records, technical specifications, the complete story of how we discovered the fraud and how the company is trying to contain it. That will make us unemployable in this industry. It will make us unemployable by companies that value corruption over competence. I can live with that limitation." Victoria met his eyes steadily. "Can you?" Ethan thought about 7 years of careful career management, of boundaries maintained and complications avoided. He thought about the moment he'd picked up Marcus's envelope, making a choice that had seemed small then, but had led inexorably to this moment. And he thought about integrity under pressure, about what it meant to stand for something when standing cost everything. "Yes," he said, "I can live with that." They spent the next 2 hours coordinating their strategy. Victoria would contact the SEC and relevant regulatory authorities, providing formal complaints backed by comprehensive documentation. Ethan would reach out to investigative journalists Victoria trusted, offering the technical expertise that would help them understand the scope of the fraud. Together, they'd prepare a joint statement explaining why they were going public despite the company's investigation, making clear that they'd tried internal channels before concluding that external pressure was necessary. By 5 p.m., the first domino had fallen. Victoria's contact at the SEC had received their documentation and confirmed it warranted immediate investigation. By 6 p.m., 2 journalists were reviewing evidence and planning stories for next week's publications. By 7 p.m., they'd sent their joint statement to the board, giving them until Monday morning to announce a legitimate investigation with external oversight or face public exposure of everything they'd found. "That's it then," Victoria said as they prepared to leave the grind for what might be the last time as people with careers in this industry. "We've committed. No turning back now." "No regrets?" "Dozens of regrets, but none about standing up when it mattered." She stood, and Ethan stood with her, understanding that this moment marked the end of one path and the uncertain beginning of another. "Whatever happens next, know that you gave me something I didn't know I needed. Proof that integrity isn't just performance or professional image. It's the choice to stand for what's right when everything else would be easier." They walked out into the evening together, rain having finally stopped, but leaving the city washed clean and gleaming. Ethan drove Victoria home through streets that looked different now, transformed by decisions made and consequences accepted. When they reached her apartment, she didn't immediately get out. "The board will respond badly," she said. "Monday morning will bring threats, intimidation, possibly immediate termination for insubordination. They'll try everything to contain this before it becomes public. Let them try. We've already given the story to people they can't intimidate or buy off. Robert will fight back too. He has resources and connections we can't match. This won't be clean or quick. Nothing worth doing ever is." Ethan took her hand, the gesture carrying commitment beyond professional partnership. "We chose this knowing the cost. Now we pay it without complaining." Victoria leaned across, and when she kissed him, it carried gratitude and trust, and the fierce determination of someone who'd found an ally for battles she'd expected to fight alone. When they separated, her expression held something close to peace, despite the chaos they'd deliberately created. "Thank you," she said simply, "for standing with me when walking away would have been safer. Thank you for showing me that safety isn't the same as strength, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to accept corruption as normal." Ethan watched her walk to her apartment, then drove home through a city that would look very different by Monday morning when their story became public. His phone was already buzzing with messages he didn't want to read. Marcus demanding explanations, colleagues asking if rumors about his involvement in Victoria's investigation were true, HR requesting his presence for a meeting first thing Monday morning. He ignored them all, choosing instead to text Victoria one final message before everything changed irrevocably. "Whatever comes next, I don't regret any of it. You were worth the risk." Her response arrived as he pulled into his parking space. "We were both worth the risk. Now we proved that doing the right thing matters more than protecting careers built on compromise." Ethan sat in his car, watching rain begin to fall again, heavier now. The kind of storm that tested foundations and revealed which structures were solid and which only appeared that way until pressure exposed their flaws. He thought about buildings constructed on fraud, about systems designed to protect corruption, about two people choosing to fight despite knowing the fight would cost them everything they'd built. And he thought about integrity under pressure, about what it meant to stand firm when everyone else was calculating angles and finding excuses. Victoria had shown him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to do what mattered, despite fear of consequences. His phone buzzed one more time, a message from an unknown number that made his stomach tighten. "This is Sarah Mitchell from the Washington Post. Victoria Kane provided your contact information regarding allegations of systematic construction fraud. I'd like to schedule an interview for tomorrow to discuss your findings. This story goes to press Monday morning. Are you prepared for what happens when it becomes public?" Ethan stared at the message, understanding that this was the final moment where he could still choose safety over truth, professional preservation over principled exposure. He could decline the interview, delete Victoria's documentation from his phone, show up Monday morning ready to cooperate with whatever sanitized investigation the board conducted. Or he could do the interview, provide the technical expertise that would make the story impossible to dismiss, and accept that Monday morning would bring the end of his career at this company in exchange for ensuring Robert's fraud got exposed regardless of how many powerful people wanted it buried. He typed a response with hands that were steady, despite everything riding on the next few words. "I'm prepared. What time works for you?" The storm intensified, rain hammering against his car with force that promised to test every structure's integrity before morning. Ethan sat in darkness, committed now to a path that would either prove that truth mattered more than power or demonstrate that systems built to protect corruption were stronger than individuals trying to expose it. Either way, he would know he'd stood for something when standing required actual courage rather than comfortable performance. He would know that when the moment came to choose between safety and integrity, he'd chosen to stand beside someone who fought for what mattered. And he would know that Victoria Kane was worth every consequence that was about to fall. The rain continued through the night, washing the city clean while Ethan prepared for the storm that would break Monday morning when the truth finally became public and everyone learned what happened when you refused to accept that corruption was just the cost of doing business. The interview with Sarah Mitchell happened Saturday morning in a quiet cafe far from anywhere Ethan might encounter colleagues or company surveillance. She arrived with a recorder, a notebook, and the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 20 years learning to recognize when a story was bigger than initial appearances suggested. "Tell me everything," she said after declining coffee and dispensing with small talk. "Start with the first moment you suspected something was wrong, and don't stop until we reach right now." Ethan told her about the Riverside inspection that revealed concrete that didn't meet specifications, about timelines that made no mathematical sense, about Victoria's courage in recruiting him to investigate despite knowing it would make her a target, about Robert Caldwell's systematic fraud across multiple projects, about the gambling pool that had been designed to provide cover for surveillance, about the company's investigation that prioritized damage control over accountability. Sarah took notes with the economical precision of someone who'd interviewed enough sources to recognize truth when she heard it. When Ethan finished, she spent several minutes reviewing her documentation, cross-referencing his technical explanations with Victoria's financial analysis, building a story that would be impossible to dismiss as speculation or personal vendetta. "This is going to destroy your career," she said finally, not as a question but as acknowledgement of cost. "You understand that, right? The moment this story publishes, you become unemployable at any company Robert Caldwell or his allies have influence with, which in this industry is most of them." "I understand. And you're doing it anyway because buildings constructed on fraudulent foundations kill people when they fail. Because systems that protect corruption over competence create environments where the next Robert Caldwell thinks he can get away with the same thing. Because someone needed to stand up and say this isn't acceptable, regardless of consequences." Ethan met her eyes steadily. "And because Victoria Kane risked everything to expose this fraud, and I wasn't going to let her fight alone." Sarah smiled, small and genuine. "That's the quote I'm going to lead with. Not the technical specifications or financial discrepancies, but the human element, two people choosing integrity over career preservation." She closed her notebook. "The story goes live Monday morning. By noon, every major outlet will have picked it up. By evening, regulatory authorities will be forced to respond publicly. And by Tuesday, your company will be in full crisis mode trying to contain damage that's already beyond containment." "What do we do until then?" "You prepare for the fallout. Lawyer up if you can afford it. There will be threats of legal action for discussing proprietary information, breach of confidentiality, anything they can think of to intimidate you into silence. Don't engage directly with company representatives without legal counsel present. And most importantly, don't back down when they try to paint you as disgruntled employees pursuing personal vendettas." Ethan thanked her and left, driving through Saturday traffic that seemed oblivious to the fact that everything was about to change irrevocably. He met Victoria for lunch at a restaurant neither of them had been to before, choosing anonymity over comfort because every public space now felt like potential surveillance. "Sarah Mitchell is running the story Monday," he told her. "She believes it'll force regulatory response regardless of what the company wants." "Good. I've heard back from the SEC. They're opening a formal investigation into the financial discrepancies I documented. And the State Construction Board is reviewing the technical violations you found." Victoria picked at her food without eating, nervous energy making appetite impossible. "It's happening, Ethan. We actually did it." "We did. Now we deal with the consequences." They spent the afternoon with a lawyer Victoria had retained, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in whistleblower protection and corporate fraud cases. She reviewed their documentation with clinical detachment, asking pointed questions about their methodology, their relationship, any potential vulnerabilities the company might exploit to discredit their testimony. "Your evidence is solid," Patricia said finally. "Technical documentation that would stand up in court, financial records that prove systematic discrepancies, timeline analysis that makes Robert's explanations mathematically impossible. But you need to understand that evidence isn't enough when you're fighting institutions with resources to wage prolonged legal battles." "What are you saying?" Victoria asked. "I'm saying the company will settle. They'll admit some irregularities occurred, implement corrective measures, quietly ask Robert to resign with a severance package that buys his silence. He'll never face criminal charges because prosecuting executives is expensive, time-consuming, and rarely successful unless fraud is so egregious that public pressure demands it." Patricia leaned forward. "But that doesn't mean you lost. You exposed fraud that would have continued indefinitely. You forced accountability in an industry that routinely protects executives at the expense of safety. That matters, even if the final outcome feels incomplete." "And our careers?" Ethan asked. "Finished at any company that values political connections over competence. But there are organizations that specifically seek people with your integrity. Regulatory agencies, watchdog groups, companies that build their reputation on refusing to cut corners. You'll land somewhere, though probably not at the salary or position you'd have reached staying silent." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "The question is whether you can live with that trade-off. Career advancement in exchange for knowing you stood up when it mattered." Ethan and Victoria left Patricia's office with retainer agreements signed and the uncomfortable awareness that they'd just committed thousands of dollars to legal representation for a fight that would define the rest of their professional lives. They walked to Ethan's car in silence, both processing implications that extended far beyond Monday's article. "Are you scared?" Victoria asked as they sat in the parking garage, neither quite ready to separate and face the weekend alone. "Terrified," Ethan admitted, "but also more certain than I've been about anything in years. We did the right thing. Whatever happens next, that foundation is solid." Victoria reached across the console, taking his hand. "I need you to know something before Monday makes everything complicated. This, us, whatever we are, isn't strategic positioning or cover story anymore. It's real. You're real. And regardless of what happens with our careers or the investigation or Robert's eventual fate, I'm grateful I found someone who chose to stand with me rather than against the system that protects people like him." Ethan pulled her closer, kissing her with the desperate intensity of someone who'd learned that authentic connection mattered more than professional advancement or carefully maintained boundaries. When they separated, he saw his own uncertainty reflected in her expression, fear of what Monday would bring, balanced against certainty that they'd made the only choice their integrity allowed. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he said. "No more fighting alone. No more pretending connection is weakness." "Together," Victoria agreed. They spent Saturday night at Ethan's apartment, ordering takeout and reviewing documentation one final time, ensuring nothing had been overlooked that could undermine their credibility when the story broke. Sunday brought a different kind of preparation, quiet hours spent not discussing the investigation but simply being together, building the kind of partnership that would need to survive whatever professional destruction Monday morning delivered. Victoria's phone rang at 11 p.m. Sunday night. The CEO calling her personal number rather than going through official channels, which meant this was either final warning or genuine attempt at resolution. She put it on speaker so Ethan could hear. "Ms. Kane, I want to make one final attempt to resolve this situation before it becomes public." The CEO's voice carried controlled urgency. "I've reviewed the evidence you and Mr. Hale compiled. I agree that serious irregularities occurred under Robert Caldwell's supervision. I'm prepared to announce his immediate termination Monday morning, full external audit of all projects he oversaw, and implementation of quality control measures that will prevent similar situations in the future." "That's a start," Victoria said carefully. "What else?" "In exchange, I need you to withdraw your complaints to regulatory authorities. Convince Mr. Ulchishishkacher Hale to decline the media interview. I'm told he's scheduled, and agree to present a unified message that the company discovered these issues through internal controls and took immediate corrective action. You want us to lie about how the fraud was discovered and who exposed it. I want us to manage a crisis in a way that protects the company's reputation while still achieving accountability for Robert's misconduct. You get what you wanted: corrupt executive removed, reforms implemented, validation that your concerns were legitimate. The company avoids regulatory scrutiny and media coverage that would devastate our stock price and credibility." The CEO paused. "And you both keep your jobs with promotions that reflect your valuable contribution to improving our quality standards." It was the offer Ethan had been half expecting since Friday, the compromise that would let everyone save face while avoiding the messy public accountability that exposed systemic failures rather than individual misconduct. Victoria looked at him, the question clear in her expression. "Is this enough, or do we keep pushing?" Ethan thought about buildings constructed on fraudulent foundations, about the people who would occupy them trusting that someone had ensured their safety. He thought about the next executive who would look at Robert's quiet resignation and generous severance and decide that fraud was a calculated risk worth taking. And he thought about integrity under pressure, about what it meant to accept partial victory when complete accountability was possible. He shook his head. "We appreciate the offer," Victoria said, her voice steady despite everything riding on the next words. "But we're declining. The story goes public Monday morning as planned. Regulatory authorities will conduct their investigations regardless of internal audits. And Robert Caldwell faces consequences that extend beyond quiet resignation with severance. Ms. Kane, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Going public will damage this company significantly. Stock prices will fall, projects will be delayed, clients will question our competence. You'll be responsible for harm that extends far beyond Robert's misconduct." "No. Robert will be responsible for harm that extends far beyond his misconduct. We're just refusing to help cover it up." Victoria's tone hardened. You had opportunities to address this fraud through legitimate channels. You chose instead to protect Robert until external pressure made protection impossible. That's on you, not us. Then you're both terminated effective immediately for breach of confidentiality, insubordination, and conduct detrimental to company interests. Security will retrieve your building access Monday morning. Final paychecks will be mailed within the week. And I'll ensure every company in this industry knows you can't be trusted to handle sensitive matters with appropriate discretion. Do what you need to do, Victoria said. We'll do the same. The line went dead, leaving them sitting in silence, processing the reality of unemployment that would begin within hours. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not regret, but the strange liberation of having nothing left to lose, no remaining leverage the company could use to compromise their integrity. We just got fired, he said. We just got free, Victoria corrected. Free to tell the complete truth without worrying about career consequences that have already happened. Free to ensure Robert faces actual accountability rather than cosmetic discipline. Free to prove that doing the right thing matters more than protecting systems built on corruption. They went to bed that night holding each other like people preparing for battle, drawing strength from connection that had started as strategic necessity and evolved into something that might survive the professional destruction Monday would bring. Ethan woke at 5 a.m. to find Victoria already up, reviewing her phone with the intense focus of someone reading news that would define the day. It's live, she said, turning the screen so he could see. Washington Post ran the story 2 hours early. Systematic construction fraud exposed by whistleblowers at major development firm. They used everything, your technical documentation, my financial analysis, the timeline of the company's attempts to contain rather than investigate. Ethan read through Sarah Mitchell's article, recognizing quotes from his interview woven through explanation of how the fraud operated and why it mattered. The story led with human element rather than technical details, to employees who'd risked their careers to expose corruption that put lives at risk, who'd chosen integrity over advancement, who'd refused to accept that fraud was just the cost of doing business. By 6 a.m., 3 other major outlets had picked up the story. By 7, the company's stock had dropped 12% in pre-market trading. By 8, regulatory authorities were issuing statements about ongoing investigations and commitment to accountability. And by 9, Ethan's phone was ringing with interview requests from journalists who wanted the complete story directly from sources rather than filtered through corporate PR. Victoria's phone rang at 9:30. Patricia Chen, their lawyer, calling with updates that suggested Monday was unfolding exactly as predicted. The SEC has escalated their investigation to include potential criminal charges. The State Construction Board is conducting emergency inspections of all projects Robert Caldwell supervised. And the company just issued a press release admitting irregularities occurred, announcing Robert's immediate termination without severance and promising full cooperation with all regulatory investigations. Patricia's voice carried satisfaction. You did it. You forced accountability that wouldn't have happened through internal channels. What about retaliation? Victoria asked. The CEO threatened to destroy our professional reputations. He can try, but he'll have to do it carefully. You're protected whistleblowers now, which means obvious retaliation could result in additional legal liability. Expect subtle undermining rather than overt attacks. Professional references that damn with faint praise, whisper campaigns about being difficult to work with, strategic exclusion from industry networks. Patricia paused. But you'll also find allies, people who respect what you did, organizations that specifically want employees willing to expose fraud rather than protect it. The industry isn't monolithic. There are companies that build their reputation on integrity rather than political connections. The day progressed with surreal speed, hours blurring together as Ethan and Victoria navigated interview requests, legal consultations, and the strange experience of watching their private investigation become public spectacle. By afternoon, Robert Caldwell's termination had been confirmed. His professional licenses were under review, and criminal charges were being considered by multiple jurisdictions. Marcus called at 3 p.m., his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. Hale, I need you to understand something. The dare, the gambling pool, all of that. I didn't know it was cover for Robert's surveillance. I thought it was just stupid office politics, not part of hiding fraud. Doesn't really matter now, does it? Ethan said. Whether you knew or not, you participated in creating cover that let Robert operate longer than he should have. I know, and I'm sorry. For what it's worth, what you and Victoria did, exposing the fraud, standing up despite knowing it would cost you everything, that took more courage than I'll probably ever have. Marcus hesitated. The dare had a $7,500 pool. It's yours if you want it. Seems like you earned it by actually asking her out and apparently starting something real in the process. Keep the money. Donate it to construction safety organizations or something useful. I got something worth more than $7,500 from that dare. I got Victoria, and I got proof that integrity matters more than career advancement. Yeah, you did. Marcus disconnected, leaving Ethan wondering if any of his former colleagues understood what they'd actually witnessed or if they'd retreat into comfortable narratives about whistleblowers being troublemakers who couldn't work within established systems. Victoria emerged from her bedroom where she'd been conducting phone interviews, exhaustion written across her face, but also something that looked like peace. The board chairman just called, not threatening, surprisingly, actually thanking me for exposing problems before they became catastrophic failures that killed people. He said the company will survive this scandal, but only because we forced accountability before buildings started collapsing. Think that's genuine or damage control? Both, probably. He's smart enough to recognize that public acknowledgement is better than continued denial. Victoria sat beside him on the couch, their shoulders touching in the easy intimacy of people who'd been through battle together. 3 companies have reached out with employment offers. Smaller firms, committed to quality over profit margins, specifically seeking people with demonstrated integrity. The positions pay less than what we were making, but the work would actually matter. Which one are you considering? Whichever one will hire both of us. I'm done fighting alone, Ethan. Whatever comes next, I want you there. She turned to face him fully. Not because of strategic necessity or professional partnership, but because somewhere in the middle of exposing fraud and risking everything, I fell in love with someone brave enough to stand beside me when everyone else was calculating angles and finding excuses. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest, the kind of truth that couldn't be taken back or dismissed as heat-of-the-moment emotion. Ethan felt his own carefully maintained boundaries crumble completely, revealing what he'd been protecting himself from acknowledging until the cost of denial exceeded the risk of honesty. I love you too, he said. I spent 7 years avoiding complications and maintaining professional distance because I thought safety was strength. You showed me that strength is choosing to stand for something when standing costs everything. You're the bravest person I've ever met, and I'm grateful every day that Marcus's stupid dare forced me to actually see you instead of hiding behind corporate protocol. Victoria kissed him, and the gesture carried relief and joy and the fierce certainty of people who'd proven their partnership could survive the worst kind of pressure. When they separated, her smile held the kind of peace that came from knowing you'd made the right choice regardless of cost. So we start over, she said. New jobs, new reputation built on integrity rather than political connections, new life together instead of careful isolation. Together, Ethan agreed. No more hiding, no more pretending connection is weakness, no more accepting corruption as the cost of participation. They spent the evening fielding calls and coordinating responses, united front against attempts to minimize their role in exposing the fraud or paint them as disgruntled employees pursuing vendettas. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, the story had grown beyond anything Ethan had imagined. Congressional representatives were calling for industry-wide investigations. Construction safety advocates were using their case as example of why stronger oversight was necessary, and business schools were already planning case studies about whistleblower ethics and corporate accountability. Robert Caldwell's attorney issued a statement denying all wrongdoing and promising vigorous legal defense, but the evidence was too overwhelming for denial to gain traction. By Wednesday, criminal charges had been filed. By Thursday, other executives who'd benefited from Robert's schemes were being investigated. And by Friday, exactly 1 week after the dare's original deadline, the company announced comprehensive reforms designed to prevent similar fraud in the future. Ethan and Victoria accepted positions at a mid-sized firm that specialized in sustainable construction and had built its reputation on refusing to compromise safety for profit. The pay was 30% less than what they'd been making. The offices were smaller, the projects were less prestigious, but the work was honest, the leadership was committed to integrity, and they'd be working together as equals rather than navigating corporate hierarchy that punished authentic connection. Think we made the right choice? Ethan asked Friday evening as they packed up Victoria's apartment, preparing to move into a place they'd chosen together rather than separately. I think we made the only choice our integrity allowed. Everything else is just calculating consequences. Victoria taped another box closed, then turned to face him. But yes, I think we made the right choice. We exposed fraud that would have continued indefinitely. We forced accountability in an industry that desperately needs it. And we proved that doing the right thing matters more than protecting careers built on compromise. Even though it cost us everything we'd built? Especially because it cost us everything we'd built. That's how you know the choice was real, when you're willing to sacrifice comfort and security and advancement for principles that actually matter. She crossed to where he stood, wrapping her arms around him. Besides, we didn't lose everything. We lost jobs and professional networks and relationships built on political convenience. But we gained something worth more, partnership based on trust and respect and shared values. That's not a bad trade. Ethan held her, understanding that she was right. The career he'd lost had been built on boundaries designed to prevent exactly the kind of connection they'd developed. The professional reputation he'd sacrificed had been built on never challenging systems that protected corruption. Trading those things for authentic partnership and integrity felt less like loss, and more like finally getting his priorities straight. 3 months later, they attended the trial where Robert Caldwell faced criminal fraud charges. The prosecution used their documentation as foundation for a case that proved systematic theft and safety violations across 18 projects spanning 3 years. Robert's attorneys mounted vigorous defense, arguing that construction variations were normal, that aggressive project management shouldn't be criminalized. The prosecution was overreach motivated by disgruntled former employees. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Robert was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, ordered to pay restitution totaling $14 million, and permanently barred from working in construction or development. 3 other executives who'd participated in the schemes pleaded guilty to lesser charges, and the company paid $200 million in settlements to clients whose projects had been compromised by fraudulent construction. Ethan and Victoria watched the sentencing from the gallery, holding hands while the judge explained that construction fraud wasn't victimless crime. It put lives at risk through buildings that might collapse, that failed safety standards, that existed only because someone decided profit mattered more than human safety. Mr. Caldwell, the judge said, you held a position of trust and authority. People relied on your expertise to ensure their safety. You betrayed that trust systematically and deliberately, not through momentary lapse in judgment, but through calculated fraud that spanned years. The sentence reflects not just the financial harm you caused, but the lives you endangered through your criminal conduct. As they left the courthouse, reporters surrounded them asking for reactions, comments, reflections on the outcome. Victoria handled it with the grace she'd developed over 3 months of being minor celebrities in construction safety advocacy circles. Justice was served, she said simply. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to send a message that fraud has consequences. We're grateful to everyone who took our evidence seriously and pursued accountability despite pressure to accept comfortable compromise. Do you regret exposing the fraud given what it cost you personally? A reporter asked. Victoria looked at Ethan, and her smile carried everything they'd built together in the aftermath of professional destruction. I regret nothing. We did the right thing, and we did it together. That's worth more than any career advancement or professional position. They walked away from the courthouse hand in hand, 2 people who'd chosen integrity over safety and discovered that the choice had been worth making. Their new jobs were challenging in different ways than their old ones had been. Less prestigious but more meaningful, less lucrative but more honest. They'd bought a house together in a neighborhood they both loved, built a life around shared values rather than separate careers, and proven that partnership based on trust could survive the kind of pressure that destroyed relationships built on convenience. 6 months after the trial, they got married in a small ceremony attended by colleagues who respected what they'd done and family who'd supported them through the chaos. Patricia Chen officiated, which felt appropriate given how much of their relationship had been forged through legal battles and whistleblower protection. The vows they wrote focused on standing together through difficulty, on choosing truth over comfort, on building foundations solid enough to support whatever structures came next. "I promise to stand with you when standing is difficult," Ethan said, holding Victoria's hands while surrounded by people who'd proven that integrity mattered more than political convenience. To choose truth over safety, to build partnership on honesty rather than performance, and to never forget that the most important things worth doing are usually the ones that scare us most. Victoria's vows matched his commitment with her characteristic directness. "I promise to trust you with my vulnerabilities, to fight beside you rather than alone, and to prove every day that choosing you was the best decision I ever made, not because it was easy or safe or professionally advantageous, but because you're worth every risk and every sacrifice." They kissed while their guests applauded. Two people who'd started with a dare designed to humiliate and ended with partnership built on mutual respect and shared courage. The reception was simple and joyful, filled with people who understood that sometimes the best outcomes emerged from choosing principles over pragmatism. Marcus attended, surprising Ethan with both his presence and his genuine congratulations. "I never thought that stupid dare would lead to this," he said. "Fraud exposure, criminal trials, you two actually falling in love and building something real. When I slid that envelope across the table, I was just trying to provide cover for Robert's surveillance and have some entertainment. Instead, I accidentally created the circumstances that destroyed his career and started yours together." "The dare was never the point," Ethan said. "The point was choosing to stand for something when standing required actual courage rather than comfortable performance. Victoria gave me that opportunity. Everything else just followed. Still, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. For the surveillance, for the manipulation, for thinking people were game pieces rather than human beings deserving respect." Marcus hesitated. "What you two did, exposing the fraud despite knowing it would cost you everything, that changed how I think about integrity and courage. Made me realize I'd spent my career confusing political skill with actual leadership." "So what are you doing differently now?" Victoria asked. "I left the company. Took a position at a nonprofit that provides construction safety training to developing countries. Pay is terrible, prestige is non-existent, but the work actually matters. Figured if you two could sacrifice careers for principles, I could sacrifice comfort for contribution." Marcus smiled ruefully. "Turns out, integrity is contagious when you see it demonstrated by people you respect." They talked for another hour, former colleagues who'd started as adversaries and evolved into something approaching friendship, through shared recognition that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting systems built on corruption. When Marcus left, Ethan felt the circle completing. What had started with a dare designed to humiliate had become catalyst for change that extended beyond their individual circumstances. Years later, Ethan would look back on that week in January when everything changed and recognize it as the moment his life actually began. Before Victoria, before the investigation, before choosing integrity over safety, he'd been existing within boundaries designed to protect him from complications and connections that might require vulnerability. After, he'd been living with purpose and partnership that made previous achievements seem hollow in comparison. They built a life together measured not in salary or prestige or career advancement, but in honest work completed, buildings constructed properly, relationships based on trust rather than transaction. They became advocates for construction safety, speaking at conferences about the importance of integrity under pressure and the systems that needed changing to prevent future fraud. They mentored young professionals who wanted to build careers on principles rather than political convenience. And they never forgot the cost of standing up when standing required sacrificing everything they'd built. Every building they inspected, every project they oversaw, every decision they made carried awareness that construction fraud wasn't abstract wrongdoing. It was concrete threat to human safety that required constant vigilance to prevent. On their 5th anniversary, they returned to the grind, the coffee shop where they'd planned their investigation and built their partnership. The corner table was occupied, but they found seats by the window and ordered the same black coffee they'd shared 5 years ago when deciding whether to expose fraud or accept comfortable compromise. "Any regrets?" Victoria asked, the question ritual now rather than genuine uncertainty. "None," Ethan said, the answer as true as it had been every time she'd asked. You? Just one. That I waited so long to let someone pass my professional armor. Think of all the time we wasted maintaining boundaries that were protecting us from exactly the kind of connection that made everything else worthwhile. We found each other when we needed to. That's enough. Victoria smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. It's more than enough. It's everything. They sat in the coffee shop watching the city move around them. Two people who'd proven that integrity under pressure wasn't performance or image or comfortable abstraction. It was choosing to stand for what mattered when standing cost everything, when walking away would have been easier, when every pragmatic calculation suggested accepting corruption as the price of participation. It was refusing to accept that calculation, choosing truth over safety, standing together when fighting alone would have been impossible, and building something real on foundations solid enough to support whatever came next. The dare that was meant to humiliate had become the catalyst that changed everything. Not because asking someone to dinner was revolutionary, but because in the process of navigating that dare, they discovered partnership worth more than any career, principles worth more than any position, and love worth more than any compromise. And they'd proven that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was exactly what scared you most: opening yourself to connection, standing for what mattered, and trusting that integrity would carry you through when every other foundation crumbled. They left the grind hand in hand, walking into a future built on trust and honesty, and the fierce determination to keep choosing what mattered regardless of cost. Behind them, the city continued its evening rhythms, oblivious to two people who'd learned that real strength wasn't avoiding complications. It was facing them with someone brave enough to stand beside you when everything was on the line. And that was worth every dare, every sacrifice, every moment of fear that had led them to exactly where they needed to be. Together.